is David Spears, and as chair of this committee, I'd like to welcome everyone to the fall meeting of the National Academy's Committee on Earth Resources. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that this building of the National Academies is physically housed on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples. We honor with gratitude the land itself, the people who have stewarded it, and the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. I would also like to review our expectations for conduct. The National Academies is committed to fostering a professional, respectful, and inclusive environment where all can participate fully in a harassment-free and discrimination-free atmosphere. We look forward to each and every one of you to help us maintain a professional and cordial environment. For a bit of background, the National Academies is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides independent, objective advice to inform policy with scientific findings. The Committee on Earth Resources is a standing committee of the Board on Earth Sciences and Resources and is responsible for developing activities on Earth resources and providing a forum for the exchange of information between the Earth resources community. This slide shows our current committee membership. And the membership changes periodically, but this is our current membership. The topic we're focusing on today is the collaborative development of subsurface pore space in multi-use basins. The subsurface is being targeted for a number of uses and processes: oil and gas recovery, geothermal development, enhanced oil recovery, wastewater injection, carbon sequestration, natural gas and hydrogen storage, and increased mining activity. How will these industries overlap, compete, or complement each other? That's the fundamental question we're addressing today. Our first speaker is Sally Greenberg. Sally is the principal owner of Sally Greenberg Consulting, LLC. She was She was unable to join us today, but she kindly recorded her presentation.
The subsurface holds material and has natural trapping mechanisms. So when we are focused on storage for whatever purpose in the subsurface, we're looking at how do we harness that natural trapping mechanism. And the way that we do that is that the earth stores water, brine, oil, natural gas in the pore spaces of rock units. And what you see here is a typical sandstone thin section that shows grain contacts, and the blue is pore space available. So you can see from this particular sandstone very high porosity and permeability. I'm going to use carbon capture and storage as an example to talk about how we engineer systems for pore space utilization. So in carbon capture and storage and many of the other technologies that you're going to be talking about today, you have some sort of surface infrastructure that either contains point sources or storage facility or some wells that are drilled into the subsurface. Likely you have some mechanism of transportation, whether that be truck or pipeline or some other mechanism. And then you have an injection well, potentially monitoring equipment, and what I think a large topic of conversation today is really going to be is what happens when you have potential multiple uses in the subsurface, and what does that imply about the usage of subsurface pore space. So typically we're focused on two main principles when it comes to storage. Do you have porosity or the open space which allows you to store something? And do you have impermeable rock units that prevent the movement of something, for example, like carbon dioxide to the subsurface? Now, if you're storing something else, so potentially you're storing nuclear spent fuel or something else, then you're going to want to use these principles maybe in the opposite way, and you want impermeable rocks that act as a sealing unit so that radioactive material or radioactive energy can't be distributed from that rock unit. With respect to carbon storage, again, as my example here, we're concerned about injectivity. Can you store something in a rock formation? Capacity, how much can you store in a rock formation? And containment, can you prevent leakage? Now, each one of the technologies that you're looking at probably have some different form of this, and maybe you don't call it injectivity, but you think about storage implications. However, I think for discussion purposes today, these are likely to be the three properties that will be underlie most of your conversation. The other factor to consider is how deep is something stored and what are the cost implications of making sure that you have adequate storage. The other thing to consider is what rules and regulations are in place to protect the subsurface and specifically underground sources of drinking water. So, as you can well imagine, there's competition for pore space. And this slide shows conventional oil and gas, unconventional hydrocarbon production, coal and mineral mining. We're seeing increasing efforts on critical minerals and rare earth elements, carbon dioxide storage, potable groundwater, as I was just talking about, saline reservoirs and minerals that might be extracted from saline brines, and or waste storage for reinjection of water from hydrocarbon production. And then you also have geothermal and even the potential for nuclear spent fuel storage, as I mentioned a minute ago. So I want to present some of the considerations that I think are important during the course of the conversation today. So you have geologic implications, you have geologic hazards, you have legal and regulatory implications, there's safety and monitoring, who bears responsibility for materials stored in the subsurface, and then there is the challenge of communicating the ideas, getting community buy-in, and really the social components of the implications of geologic storage. So there's a couple of diagrams here. One I like, and that is what are the boundaries to consider. You have land surface, you have potential from ownership from the land to the sky and the minerals to the center of the earth, which is a conventional way of describing or defining pore space that hasn't been tested necessarily in the American legal system. And then the other thing to bring your attention to is the underground injection control program regulated or enacted through the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is to protect the underground sources of drinking water, and you have different classes for different activities. Class 1 is for the industrial and municipal waste disposal, so that's hazardous and non-hazardous material. Class 2 is related to oil and gas production and reinjection of wastewater. You have class 3, which is related to solution mining and salt cavern mining. And then class 4, which there are some class 4 wells, but you can't actually get a class 4 permit. That's for shallow and hazardous radioactive waste. And these are essentially banned injection wells. You have class 5, which is about non-hazardous fluid injection and also experimental wells. And then the most recently promulgated rule is for class 6 for the geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide specifically. So some of the considerations I think will underlie your conversation today when it comes to pore space, pore space usage. This can be you have multiple wells storing the same material, or you have multiple uses for a reservoir or a location. So plume interaction, where are your plumes? Do you have the right kind of modeling? What is the projected interaction of plumes over the course of a lifetime? Where do areas of review interact? And what are the surface implications of those interactions? You have the potential for induced seismicity. Is your injection going to or have the potential to induce, whether it be microseismicity on the order of -1 to +1 magnitude, or felt seismicity, as we've seen in some wastewater disposal related to oil and gas activities? So what are the implications for induced seismicity, and how much increased pressure do you put on the reservoir through your storage activities? Another thing to consider is monitoring, and what kinds of monitoring are required for various subsurface activities. Another thing to think about is, can you leverage one set of monitoring technologies for example, carbon dioxide, and then share that with oil and gas activities? So are there ways that we can enhance our ability to monitor the subsurface and use the wide range of monitoring technologies that we currently have and we continue to develop? What can we do in terms of mitigating risk, verifying storage, and our protection of the environment? So all of those things, I think, underlie our need for better understanding of the subsurface. The legal and regulatory system, what standards are we using? What are the relationships between private remedies and public regulations? This is an interesting paper I point everybody to about subsurface trespass, and what are the equity considerations? How do we adhere to standards and best practices, and what are the existing legal precedences for the activities that are being undertaken? And lastly, I highlight the social components of the conversation that we're having. And I think one thing to consider that I've been thinking a lot about lately is that we make the basic assumption that we have subsurface and surface access, that we have the ability to utilize the subsurface, and that we have societal assent to do these things. I think those of us who have been in the science and engineering and policy space related to the use of the subsurface for utilization and for storage believe that where there's a will, that there's a way. And I encourage you to challenge yourself to think about whether or not that assumption is really true, and what do we need to do in terms of increasing society's comfort level with us utilizing the subsurface for storage and as well as production, as we have for the last 100 or 150 years. So with that, I'd like to wrap up my remarks. I hope that you have a very productive conversation today, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you might have in the future. Thank you.
Well, we'd like to thank Sally for giving such a great introductory talk. Our next introductory talk is by Zach Pendleton. Zach is the founder and chief executive officer of FCM Carbon Solutions. Zach?
Thanks, David.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. As David said, I'm Zach Pendleton, Right now, spending time in the carbon sequestration space, but have a background in oil and gas. And today I'm going to talk about the DJ Basin, which I think is a great case study for multi-use basins, multi-uses of pore space, as we have a lot going on in that basin right now. So just a quick introduction to myself, my background. I've spent the majority of my career in and around in and around the DJ Basin. On the personal side, I was born and raised in Colorado, went to the University of Colorado Boulder. Once I graduated, started with Noble Energy in Denver, focused on the DJ Basin. Different from many folks here, I do not have a technical background. I have a business background. So I come at this from more of the business mindset. I did run the asset development organization for Noble Energy in Denver. So all of our surface and subsurface from the new drill side. So have at least some dangerous enough on the subsurface and the DJ to provide some insight there. In 2020, I exited Noble and I founded Fulcrum Carbon Management, became FCM Carbon Solutions. This is a geologic carbon sequestration project developer, primary project in Northeast Colorado in the DJ. So lots to talk about there. So if we look at the DJ Basin, just as an overview here, started as an oil and gas basin. The DJ runs Northeast Colorado, runs up into Wyoming, parts of Nebraska. The basin itself butts up against the Rocky Mountains, then drops sharply down before rising as you head toward the eastern plains. The diagram here on this slide, you see the Wattenberg field. That's really the core of the DJ Basin, and that's in Northeast Colorado. And that was originally a gas play. As unconventional developed, it's become more of an oil play. I believe now it's top 5 in production in both oil and natural gas. So it's a very active basin. A lot of wells, a lot of new development going on there. In terms of the horizons that are targeted, so the conventional sandstones on either side of the Niobrara, and Niobrara's in blue, have been targeted, for 50 plus years. Was really active in the 90s, 80s, 90s. The unconventional development itself started in the late 2000s, and that's been targeting the Niobrara for the most part. Some of the Codell, but it's not a deep basin. We're talking vertical depth in the 7,000, 6,500 to 7,500 foot range for the most part. So we look at other subsurface operations here. So we have all the active oil and gas, right? And that, the strat column on the right here, I don't expect you guys to read all of those formations. This is more just illustrative here of where things are located so we can orient ourselves within the subsurface. So we have the oil and gas pay zones. Like I said, those run down to about 7,500 feet. And then below the Dakota, we get into the commercial produced water disposal zones. And that, with unconventional development, this doesn't have as much water to oil. The water to oil ratio is lower than it is, say, in the Permian. But, as with anything, we are producing water as we produce oil. So we're injecting into those produced water disposal zones. And we actually have a commingled zone. So a lot of these wells are perfed all the way down, from below the Dakota all the way down to the fountain. And they inject in there, don't really track exactly what formation it goes into. It just goes into the commingled disposal zone. Now, within that area, we also have growing interest in carbon sequestration. So we don't have any active carbon sequestration projects, injecting projects today in the DJ, similar to just about everywhere else in the U.S., but there's a lot planned, a lot of work going on. And the formations that we're targeting exist within those produced water commingled disposal horizons. So the Entrada, the Lions, the Upper Fountain have been identified as good targets. As Sally mentioned, right, we're looking for areas that have good porosity, good pore space, but have an impermeable layer over the top to keep the CO2 contained. So that's really what we're looking at here, and those are the formations that we've targeted. one of the complicating factors here, and I have a red hashed formation there, is the Lions Formation. That formation is actually productive in majority of, or not the majority, but it's productive in parts of the basin, predominantly to the northeast. So, even if we're talking about stratifying it, by ownership, right? Pore space ownership is the surface owner, mineral owners own the minerals. If you try and stratify it by formation, and you say, the Lions Formation, well, it depends on where you are. And that can get complicated, as we look to the future and we say there may not be commercially viable minerals today, but are there in the future, right? So that speaks to some of the things we're going to talk about, I'm sure today, of how these uses can coexist, cooperate, who has dominance, that sort of thing. So I did not mention geothermal. I am by no means an expert in geothermal. I don't have much exposure to it, so I wanted to kind of stay in my lane. So I'll let people smarter than me in that area comment on it. But I know there is geothermal that's being explored in Colorado today. There is, I think there is active projects that are going to occur, but I'm not going to speak too much on that, so I don't get too far out of my depth. So we look at the DJ here, the central DJ basin and aerial view. This to me really illustrates what we're talking about with all of these operations interacting, right? So the red dots are oil and gas wells. The blue squares are produced water disposal wells, and the green circles are planned CO2 sequestration wells at this point in time. And, from a surface standpoint, yes, it looks crowded on the map, right? And it is. But from a surface standpoint, it's not necessarily challenging finding space, because we can reutilize infrastructure. It's challenging sometimes from a permitting, building units, that kind of thing in Colorado. But the key here is they're so close together that the operations are always going to interact. So if we think about the previous slide, even though they might be stratified, say, oil and gas and carbon sequestration, for instance, right? Carbon sequestration is taking place below the oil and gas development. The target zones are different, but you're still passing through either a depleted oil and gas zone or a to be depleted oil and gas zone as you try and reach your target formation. And, when you're talking about unconventional development with high pressure fracs, you get in a situation where you could have wellbore damage, you could have leaks. And so it becomes complicated where, even if you stratified the zones of where these activities take place, there's still going to be interaction within wellbores, passing through different areas that folks are using. Further complicating matters, I think, if you look on here, you're looking at 2 different CO2 sequestration companies, 3+ saltwater disposal operators, and who knows how many, 20+ oil and gas operators, right? So even if you can set up a cooperation between a couple of parties, you're going to have many interested parties in a given area. And so if you have a produced water disposal company, a CO2 sequestration company working together, well, there could be a couple other ones that have interest in the area that don't see things the same way. So it's pretty hard, to handle it within just the private market itself because there are so many interested parties. Lastly, in Colorado, and this is as it stands right now, but we are working on getting this changed. Both the ECMC and the EPA have jurisdiction over different operations here. The ECMC is formerly the COGCC, which is our Oil and Gas Commission. The EPA, the Oil and Gas Commission has jurisdiction over oil and gas, saltwater disposal, and geothermal, I believe. EPA still has jurisdiction over Class 6 wells, as Sally mentioned. Those are the carbon sequestration wells. So Colorado is pursuing primacy to remedy that. So it's all going to live under the ECMC. But for now, you have multiple operations targeting similar zones that are going through different permitting agencies, which creates its own difficulties. So to wrap up, Sally touched on a lot of this in her presentation, so I won't spend too much time here. But just the challenges and open questions with multi-use basins and kind of applying the DJ to this. So, Sally mentioned induced seismicity, right? And that's something that we look at. And I think the overlapping of plumes, we can map where the CO2 is going. For produced water disposal that are utilizing the same zones, or oil and gas, right? You can try and map depletion. What's more difficult is mapping the pressure front and getting confidence in that without actually having, monitors below ground monitoring the pressure itself. So in terms of induced seismicity in the DJ, it's not like the Permian in Texas or Oklahoma, right, where we see a ton of events, but we do have some. So in the Greeley earthquakes, 2014 to 2016, that's when unconventional development was at its peak in the DJ basin. The more famous ones were the Denver earthquakes, where there was injection in the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. So induced seismicity is a concern here, and something we'll need to monitor as you have these operations, potentially competing for pore space and pressure. And that raises a number of other questions. I won't touch on all of these because I know this is a lot of the stuff we're going to discuss. But on the legal regulatory side, right, pore space ownership and dominance of the estate, who wins in a permitting battle, right? All of those things I think are going to need to be addressed. And from an economic standpoint, I call this economic, but can be, business consideration as well, right? The question is really, is it better to cooperate or compete? And I think as we look at this, it's not, as a private operator, it's difficult to look at the basin scale. It's often not in our best interest to look at something on a basin wide scale, right? So I think we look to folks like, that are on the call today, on these panels today, to look at it, that can take that, 30,000 foot view of the basin and say, okay, we need to set up a framework to allow cooperation, but also some carrots and sticks to incentivize cooperation, so we don't get in a scenario where we have competition below the subsurface or in the subsurface, when we don't necessarily even have all the data of what's going on down there today. So with that, I'll end my remarks, and I hope that sets the stage for you all to have a good discussion. Thinking about the DJ as a case study, somewhere where a lot of this is very prevalent today, and very needed. So with that, I don't know if we have a time for a quick question or two, but happy to take them if we do.
Thank you, Zach. And we are running a little ahead of schedule, so we do have time for a question or two. And there is a question here in the chat from Scott Anderson. Zach, do you foresee a need for Class 5 wells in addition to Class 6 wells? And we note that Colorado currently lacks Class 5 primacy as well as Class 6.
Oh, that's a great question. And Scott, that's probably a bit beyond my area of expertise. I think right now, personally, I believe as much we can get under one roof, as much as we can do that, it's beneficial, right? So you have somebody that's thinking about all the different impacts of all these operations. Whether or not we need Class 5, that I don't know. But I think, in the event it's determined that Class 5s are beneficial, I think Colorado getting primacy would be critical to make sure that we take into account all of the potential impacts of these different operations.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Zach.
Yep.
Okay, I'm now going to turn it over to Aaron Campbell to begin the discussion part of our meeting with first panel discussion.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yes. Thank you, David. We will now move into our first panel discussion on permitting and potential interferences in multi-use basins. We are joined by three expert panelists, Nick Tu, Kara Fornstrom, and Kimberly Wirtz. I will ask each of them to first introduce themselves and then give us a 2-minute summary of what they think are the biggest permitting and interference challenges in multi-use basins and where more scientific information or policy change is needed. So let's start with Kimberly.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me. I am an oil and gas attorney, energy attorney in Oklahoma. I have a background in operations and was a senior landman for several years before I became an attorney. So right now, my practice is really focused on traditional and non-traditional forms of energy. And I also am a big part of the IOGCC, which is the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. There, I am the chair of the Legal and Regulatory Affairs Committee. It feels like so many words and so many titles, so I abbreviate a lot. But I am the chair of that committee, and we currently are working, we have a task force that is working on this topic. We are reevaluating our traditional model legislation for pore space and carbon capture, sequestration, and storage. And within that, we have been working with this task force, which is just a group of our committee members that are basically volunteering their free time to help on this. With that, they have identified several areas that we need to address from a regulatory and a legal standpoint. And so that's a big project we're working on. And that's kind of what brings me here today, is to hopefully bring some insight from that group as well. Above and beyond that, I'm happy to be here. But I think, just to summarize kind of what I think are some of the biggest concerns right now in terms of permitting interference with this multi-use basins is right out the gate regulatory capacity. I think that's a big one that we have identified that is a concern. Do our agencies have proper amount of support? Who is the agency, kind of like Zach was talking about? Are we getting it all under one roof, or are we spread out among multiple agencies? Do we have training? Are we able to provide them with guidance, enough models, and make sure that they can take on these new larger projects? Another big one, I will concur with Zach on the ownership. There's a lot of ownership contrasts among the states, and that can, I think, is going to create maybe some longer term hurdles than what we currently are dealing with right now. Texas views empty pore space ownership one way. It's viewed completely different in other states. And so if you look at the bordering states and you have to try to put their regulations and their laws against each other, that creates some hurdles. So clarity and ownership is a big one. And I think there's also the idea of the order of priority in terms of estate dominance. Who comes first? How are we going to evaluate the rights? And with that, the community engagement to get them to understand. We've had some legislation go through in this topic. We've had some legislation in states fail. And so there's some areas where I think there's a lot of community engagement that we still need to work on as well. And so I think those are kind of my three big takeaways for right now. Otherwise, I will pass it on to the next.
Thank you, Kimberly. Next, I will ask Nick to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. So glad to be here today, and I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion. I'm Nick Tew, as Aaron indicated. I'm the state geologist of Alabama and the oil and gas supervisor. In these roles, I serve as director of the Geological Survey of Alabama and the director of the staff of the State Oil and Gas Board. I'm also the current president of the Groundwater Protection Council, where there's an awful lot of activity around CO2 storage and Class 6 wells and that sort of thing right now, as well as, like Kimberly, I'm very involved with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. In my regulatory role in Alabama, I'm the chief oil and gas regulator. And now we've been charged by the Alabama legislature to regulate geologic CO2 sequestration, along with geologic storage of other gases such as hydrogen. So we're currently involved in developing our CO2 sequestration rules, very far along with that now. And we ultimately intend to apply for Class 6 primacy from EPA. I've been in my current roles for 21 years, and I've been at the survey for almost 40, but I started my career as a petroleum geologist in the oil and gas industry, primarily working the Gulf Coast Basin. And then when I came to the survey, I got involved in work focusing on stratigraphy and sequence stratigraphy of the surface and subsurface strata of the eastern Gulf coastal plain. And this is resulted in extensive field time, as well as subsurface work with geophysical well log, seismic data, cores, and samples. So I have a really good knowledge of the Mesozoic and Cenozoic strata in the subsurface of the Gulf Coast Basin, and a good working knowledge of a lot of other basins around the country. In my regulator role, I have I think a good understanding of the legal regimes that oversee development of the subsurface, such as oil and gas regulations related to exploration and production, underground injection control. We have primacy over Class 2 wells here at the State Oil and Gas Board, and also the protection of groundwater resources and the environment. I'm very familiar also with surface and subsurface property right issues related to the development of the subsurface and how the surface and mineral estates interact with each other. Some of the biggest things that I see right now, I think that when we see CO2 sequestration deployed at scale, there's going to be some natural tension between the surface and mineral estates. It's already been alluded to in the previous talks and by Kimberly as well. In many states, the concept of pore space ownership or rights have not been dealt with either in law or in the courts. So I think we're going to see some activity in those areas as we move forward to kind of get some clarity in some of this. I think there are a lot of assumptions out there about pore space ownership, but really it's not settled. In Alabama, in my state, the coastal plain area will see a lot of multi-use action. We'll have continued oil and natural gas production, significant use of the abundant groundwater resources that we have for public water supply and domestic and agricultural use, sequestration and storage of CO2 and other gases. We have 3 major announced projects in the state right now that's moving through the EPA process, and we're working very closely with EPA on those. And it's going to be interesting to see how the various uses interfere, or if through effective regulation and policy development, we can actually find ways where they can complement each other. In terms of the scientific information and policy changes, in my view as a geologist, we never have enough subsurface data to characterize and evaluate all aspects of geology that's under our feet. In more mature basins, such as the Gulf Coast Basin, which is the one I'm most familiar with, there's generally an abundance of data in certain areas. We have logs, cores, 3D seismic in some cases, older seismic data. But there may not be enough in areas that are more attractive for CO2 or hydrogen hubs, just because they seem to be right now trying to avoid some of the areas where there's more concentrated oil and gas activity. So as policies and regulatory regimes evolve, we need to assure that we have adequate data for site characterization, modeling, monitoring, and all these other things that we need to know about these projects and about the subsurface. We need all of that to be collected and thoroughly evaluated. Regulations and policies for various subsurface uses should be developed to protect, of course, the public, environment, and the correlative and co-equal rights of all the interest owners. And I think some of these topics are the ones that we will be discussing today. And again, I'm just glad to be here. I look forward to discussion with everyone, and I'll move it to the next person.
Thank you, Nick. Now I'll turn it over to Kara.
Thanks, Erin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kara Fornstrom. I'm the director of the Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis at the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. My background, I'm trained as an attorney. I practiced water law in Wyoming for quite a few years and then was appointed to the Public Service Commission. So I also have a background as a utility regulator. I've been at the university now for about a year, and at the center of at SERPA, but is the short name for what I do. We work across the other centers at the School of Energy Resources, one of which is the Center for Economic Geology Research, which currently is pursuing 4 separate carbon safe projects. So management of CCS or of pore space for CCS projects is critically important to us. We in Wyoming started our efforts to establish a cohesive regulatory and statutory framework for CCS for carbon management in 2010, and we continue that today with our most recent edition of legislative mandate last year to try to complete what we refer to as the 6 pillars of CCS management. Our CCS industry in Wyoming really hinges on regional challenges because of our geographic footprint. As many of you may know, the federal government owns approximately 50% of our surface land ownership, and we border 6 other states. So we have been pretty focused on the policy gaps between Wyoming's regulatory and statutory framework compared to our 6 neighbors and the federal government, because it's difficult to imagine any of our carbon safe projects being able to go forward without agreement and similar statutory and regulatory frameworks related to those 6 pillars. And I'll list those briefly, and we can talk about them more in detail in a moment. But the first is Class 6 Enforcement Authority. Many of you may know Wyoming received Class 6 primacy in October 2020. We're only the 2nd state in the country to achieve that. Second is pore space ownership. Third is pore space unitization. 4, long-term stewardship of geologic storage formations. 5, pore space versus mineral estate dominance. And 6 is subsurface trespass liability. So Wyoming has addressed all of those 6 pillars in our regulatory and statutory framework to date. And we just issued from SERPA about 2 weeks ago a paper summarizing the policy gaps between Wyoming's 6 pillars and our neighboring states, and including the federal government. And I hope it's a document that will be a guidepost for others who are trying to make sure they have those 6 pillars in place so that CCS projects can move forward, and maybe help encourage those other states and our federal government to catch up with us a little bit so that we can have long-term success for these projects. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you, Kara. We will now move into the question and answer section of the panel. But first, a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions to the panel on our webpage live stream. Just look for the Slido box underneath the live stream video. To start with, I have some questions I'd like to ask, but are there any questions from the committee at this time that they would like to ask? And if not, I will move into my questions. So as we've discussed, there are multiple industries that are targeting the subsurface for different uses. Do you see any, currently at this time, do you see those different uses working in competition or being able to work together to utilize the pore space?
Well, I'll jump in. I'm going to give a great lawyer answer and say it depends. I've had some projects where I think the cooperative effort is very much there, but in those projects, it has been very much landowner driven to some degree. In other words, it's kind of the rare unicorn of projects where a landowner might own the surface and the minerals, and he sort of has all the power to force these guys to cooperate. On another scale, I would say it is competitive. I've seen, some are very pushback. The oil and gas industry can be a little bit stubborn sometimes. They don't like change. And in my experience, they're very used to being that dominant estate. And so I do see some conflict. I deal with conflict right now just between produced water injection and oil and gas development. They protest each other all the time. And so I think, again, it depends, but there is potential there for it to be cooperative. I just don't see it as often as what I'd like.
Could I add quickly to that, Aaron? For the big projects that are announced in Alabama, most of the companies behind these projects are oil and gas, come out of the oil and gas sphere. So I think they do have at least an appreciation of the various, issues that have to be addressed. And again, it seems to be, at least for the bigger projects, they're staying a little bit away from where we have concentrated oil and gas activity. So as this develops and evolves, certainly there could be, some room for more competition. But right now it seems to be somewhat cooperative and complementary from what I've seen.
And Aaron, I would just add, our 6 pillars for pore space are not specific to CO2. And so I think because we've addressed it from a universal perspective of pore space ownership and trying to deal with conflicts. While different industries may be courting those landowners, I think our statutory and regulatory framework is fairly clear about what can go forward there. So there may be some competition for the actual leases, but in terms of the pore space regulation, I think Wyoming's statutory framework has the flexibility to allow for competing uses within that.
Thank you. Those are excellent answers. And I see that Doug Hollett, one of our committee members, has a question. Doug?
Oh, great. Thanks, Aaron. It wasn't too long ago that CCS was something that was not on the horizon and not envisioned. I mean, now we talk about it as one of the sort of the new uses of the subsurface. What I'm curious about is the extent to which we can anticipate a handful of additional new uses of the subsurface. And so the ones I've sort of made a note about was fundamental basinal hydrogen. There's a bunch of new research on basinal hydrogen rather than storing hydrogen or such in the subsurface. Thermal storage, using the earth basically as a battery. So yes, a little bit different than geothermal. It's actually using the thermal properties of the subsurface. Metals and brines, and we've got some really good examples of that. The SMAC over in South Arkansas is probably the best one right now. And then other kinds of geothermal. And here I'm thinking about the closed loop geothermal work that's being done by a number of companies coming out of the oil and gas sector. And so these are all in addition to the ones we already have, and the extent to which we can anticipate those new uses. And there are probably going to be some more beyond that.
Any comments from the panel? Okay, Tamika, did you have a question? She's also a committee member.
Hello, I am a geologist at an oil and gas company, and my experience dates back a bit when it comes to working in the U.S. soil. But some of the problems or issues that we had was timing of permitting. Is there and my experience was over 15 years ago. And unfortunately, there was a bit of time lapse that we had when it comes to our current operations timing versus the governing bodies timing aspects. So are there more open forums on really explaining the process, not just to the company's permitting person, but also maybe to the subsurface team? Because, subsurface team has a plan in place of what they would like to do with the pore space, as well as, the drillers or the operating team have their timing. So is a better, I wouldn't say better, maybe it was us, but a really solid way of timing, right? So really explaining to the companies or the industries on how to submit the right proper paperwork, as well as getting that permit in place in time.
Well, I know that in terms of EPA for Class 6 wells, just using that as an example right now, they do have a process for when you submit an application where first they go through and they do what I think is called an administrative approval, that everything that you've submitted, everything that you need to submit, and then it goes through a technical approval process prior to the permit actually being issued. That's a lengthy process, and they actually have now on their website, they have all of the permit applications that are in place in the country, and then kind of more or less a timeline of how that should play out. So that would be one place to look. I think the states are just equipped to be a little more agile and responsive once more states start getting Class 6 primacy for CO2. And I know we're pretty speedy with our oil and gas permits in Alabama, and also our Class 2 permits. So, a couple of comments there.
And I can add a little bit about the Wyoming experience. As I said, we have Class 6 primacy. We should be issuing, or the DEQ will be issuing, I think, the first 3 Class 6 well permit application or permits maybe this week or next. So we're very close to getting those issued. The School of Energy Resources is a co-applicant on all three of those. We have found the process to be pretty streamlined. These are the first ones, so they probably have taken a bit longer, but a good development of the regulatory framework for those. We've been impressed with the interaction we've had with DEQ in getting these processed, and I know that they extend that kind of open door policy to anyone who's looking at an application for a Class 6 well. And then one other thing I would note about the way that they've gone forward on the actual process, it does require a public hearing. And so that was held a couple of weeks ago. And I think the DEQ did a really smart thing there. And I think they'll continue this in the future where they, before the hearing started, they scheduled an information hearing for the hour before. And so people that were interested in perhaps protesting came to that information hearing. The DEQ really walked through the whole process to get a Class 6 well permitted. And by the time it got to the hearing, the potential protesters had their questions answered during the information hearing, and the public hearing lasted 17 minutes. And so it was a really good process, I think. I think it speaks highly to the efforts that DEQ has done with the public and with applicants and interested parties to make sure that the questions are answered, that people feel confident about these wells, these permits going forward. And we're really excited about this first wave getting granted, and we look forward to many more, and that the process will be even more streamlined as we move forward.
We had some comments from my counterpart in North Dakota, Lynn Helms, at the IOGC meeting recently, where they basically did the same thing with the informational part of, they didn't really call it a public hearing, but for the informational part, they went through and did answer a lot of questions there. But rather than allowing people to line up at a microphone and, have their say, they had tables set up around the room that people could go to get more detailed answers to the questions. And North Dakota found that worked very well for them. And I think we all should take a look at that model. And then, of course, we have our normal hearing process to go through for the approvals and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. I see Gary has a hand up. Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And my background's from the mining side of things, but also the geology and the understanding of the basins. And Nick, you kind of mentioned all the available data that's out there. I know from the mining side, we don't always share that data a whole lot. And what sort of things are in place across the country to share that information that's out there? Are there already places that we have that data pulled together? How's that handled? Because I think that would be key to getting a better technical understanding.
Well, I think we're rather lucky here in Alabama, and it's kind of a unique setup where the State Geological Survey and the State Oil and Gas Board are actually housed at the same location under the same director. So we have all of the oil and gas information, everything, all the geophysical well logs, mud logs, sample data, all of that on the Oil and Gas Board side of the house. And then we have all of the cores and samples that have been collected over many years on the Geological Survey side of the house. So we can put all of that together. And we've recently been we're the recipient of a DOE grant that's going to allow us to do exactly that relative to CO2 sequestration, is put together all of the data sources that we have in one place, so that someone can take a look at that and get what they need. And also, we're going to develop a subsurface model that somebody could come in and take a look at for the coastal plain. The only thing we don't have, that we don't require that it be submitted to us, is seismic data. We don't get that. That's held proprietary. And but everything else by law has to be submitted to the State Oil and Gas Board or the Geological Survey.
Is that just specific to Alabama, or is that across the country?
I think you'll find it's variable as you move across the country, what is required to be submitted, how long confidentiality periods are, things like that. But in terms of cores and samples, we don't have not only oil and gas cores and samples, but we have a lot of, industrial cores and hard rock cores and those kinds of things, talking about the mining sector that you referred to.
Thank you.
And Aaron, I'd like to just maybe toss this back to you because I think you're better to talk about this than I am, but I think it'd be a good time for you to talk a little bit about the database for carbon storage that we're doing in Wyoming in partnership with your group, DEQ and the School of Energy Resources.
Thanks, Kara. I'm actually the state geologist of Wyoming, and Nick, we also got a DOE grant to create a database where people that are applying for permits can go to access accurate data, and where DEQ can go to verify the data that they see on the permit applications so that everyone is working from the same data source. And so we're doing a similar thing to you as you are in Alabama.
Aaron, I think maybe 7 or 8 state geological surveys funded under that program to do similar things. So that's a start.
It is. And actually, I'd like to, while we're talking about what different states are doing, I'd like to lead the discussion towards the issue of state boundaries, because we are dealing with federal, state, and private ownership of the pore space. And so state boundaries are going to become an issue because these the plumes and the use don't end at state lines. So there are 2 aspects to this. There's both the geologic and data, and then there's also the permitting. So first, let's talk a little bit about what we could do to increase our multi-purpose cross-border 3D geologic mapping and how we could use that framework to help us with the permitting that we need to do and the regulations that we'll need to have in place to cross boundaries. So first, the geologic side. Nick, do you have any thoughts on how we could make those models not state-centric?
Yes, we've recently had a good funding stream from the USGS to do stratigraphic reconciliation and correlation across state lines. So the first project we were involved in was Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, and where we're doing exactly that to kind of, understand the geology across the state boundaries and how things change, what the facies changes are, what the rock bodies look like, all of that sort of thing. And we're having a lot of success with that. And then we were asked to extend that to Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. So we have all of the Gulf Coast states now involved in a stratigraphic reconciliation and correlation project where we hopefully can find some common ground and a better understanding of the strata as we move across the region. So that's something that's going on right now. And it includes everything from basement to basically grassroots. So all of the targets for carbon sequestration, all of the oil and gas producing horizons in the Gulf Coast Basin are being looked at. Plus, we're doing a groundwater aspect as well.
Great. So I wonder if any of our other panelists would like to chime in on in terms of the regulation and permitting and what happens when you reach a state boundary in terms of those things.
Well, I might just hit on the 2 of the pillars that we're most concerned about that from a policy gap perspective, and that's pore space ownership and the ability to enter into unitization agreements as these CO2 plumes migrate. And of our 6 states, in terms of ownership, Montana, Nebraska, and Utah have addressed that, but Colorado, Idaho, and South Dakota have not. Similarly, for pore space unitization, I think it's the same list of states. And more importantly for us is the federal government has not decided on these issues as well. And it's very difficult for us to think of any of our 4 carbon safe projects going forward without implicating federal lands. And so in order for us to actually start injecting, we have to have clear ownership. For the federal government, they have not addressed ownership from a split estate perspective, and they do not have authority to enter unitization agreements. And so those are the 2 big areas that we're concerned about in terms of our projects being able to move forward once we're ready, once we have the application, the permits granted, we have everything ready to go. The actual regulatory components related to ownership and unitization are going to be critical before any actual injection can occur.
I wanted to also just add in that, we look at it from a state to state issue. Sometimes it's within the state that you have these border problems. So one of the things that we've been addressing within like the state of Oklahoma is we have tribal land. but it's butted up right next to private land. And so we have inter and intra-state border issues that we have to sometimes consider. So I just wanted to add that.
Those are excellent points. In terms of what you mentioned, Nick, in reconciling stratigraphic names, you can have stratigraphy that don't correlate across a single basin, as Zach alluded to earlier in his presentation. And so a few of you mentioned unitization. Nick, would you like to discuss unitization a little? You probably deal with that in your role as oil and gas supervisor. If you could explain what that is and how that applies to how we use that in terms of oil and gas and how we might need to use that in terms of carbon sequestration as well.
So yes, we have a unitization process in Alabama that is basically the amalgamation of rights for, across an entire oil and gas field or even a partial field. And so then so if you have an enhanced recovery project, for example, with water injection and hopefully at some point CO2 injection, everybody within the unitized area, whether their wellbore is an injector or a producer, they share in all of the proceeds that come from that. So we have that in oil and gas. And natural gas storage, it's actually an eminent domain process that you go through. The board will actually, through a hearing, approve the project, and then it's up to the operator to go to a court to get eminent domain. But you have to have a certain percentage of the rights already wrapped up in that case that before you go to the court with the eminent domain process. We foresee carbon storage or carbon sequestration being basically the same as natural gas storage. In fact, when we changed our statute, we amended our natural gas storage statute to include carbon dioxide and other gases. So we see that same kind of amalgamation process playing out there rather than a unitization. I think in Wyoming, you guys are using unitization by the State Oil and Gas Board. Is that right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think a lot are using unitization. Oklahoma is a unitization forced pooling state, very powerful statute. Texas is not. And I know their legislation that they recently rejected had contemplated unitization, and it got a lot of public pushback. So that kind of ties into, public outreach and, continuing type of education for just landowners and mineral owners alike. But I do think that's a great contrast and a great comparison to look at, is the idea that Texas wholeheartedly is pushing against unitization. So they may end up in an eminent domain type of structure, whereas Oklahoma, I don't think we're so accustomed to it at this point. I could see us just not really batting an eye at it.
And in terms of amalgamation of rights, one thing that we've already seen here in Alabama with the big announced projects, the operators are primarily working with big landowners like timber companies that have this fee simple. So they've got, a huge swath of acreage. And so there really won't be an amalgamation process in there because the same owner owns everything. And that's certainly a safe way to go about doing this as you move ahead.
The best kind of owner to find.
And that's why the offshore is attractive, or, got one owner.
Great, thank you. I see that Doug has another question. Doug.
Yeah, Kimberly, you mentioned tribal lands, and this is actually a two-part question. They're sort of linked. Does your thinking go both to deeded lands but also treaty lands? And that to me leads to sort of a broader question about we're talking about the legal and the regulatory framework. But there's also this aspect of public consultation. Who are stakeholders, or maybe to put it another way, is there anybody who's not a stakeholder when we start talking about these topics? How do you engage with them and make this a broader topic rather than just a who wins in a legal or regulatory contest?
So here, I know one of the big things we did, we had a lot of pushback between state and tribal. We have McGirt, the big Supreme Court decision on the books that's causing us a lot of regulatory headache. I don't think it was intended. It's a criminal case, but has overflowed into our state agencies' ability to properly have jurisdiction over tribal natural resources. It's being challenged regularly by the tribes on the eastern portion of the state. And so we have that one aspect. We have McGirt that's causing us some regulatory uncertainty. We have Osage Nation, which is kind of in the northern eastern portion of the state. It is a one of a kind, the way that they have severed and become very insulated in terms of their natural resource protections. So we address them on a completely different level than what I think we even do some of the other tribes. When it comes to communication, what we've learned is opening up the table to seats is very beneficial. We had huge disputes over groundwater rights in Oklahoma, and we've made some changes to where some of these tribes that are actually represented near these groundwater sources, they are allowed to sit on the committee and give a voice. And that helps with the education, not only to the tribe, but also just to the general public. I do think we have some serious hurdles to overcome right now with the McGirt case, and that is going to cause us some regulatory hurdles to overcome. Right now, it's the Corporation Commission and our ODEQ and Oklahoma Water Resource Board. It's our state agencies that are overseeing tribal land. If these cases go through and are actually the way the tribes want it to be, it will be federal. It will become a federal jurisdiction. We will have federal agency over those lands. So we have to then step back and decide as a state, how are we going to be able to enter into either, treaties, compacts, whatever needs to take place to continue to develop our full state's resources. I'm not certain on other states. That's, Oklahoma's kind of my stomping ground. And so that's my exposure mostly to tribal lands has been within our inside borders. And it's been mostly environmentally driven. The tribes, that's probably, in my experience, that's their concern. They want to make sure the water is protected. They want to make sure their air is protected and their soil is protected. And so I don't know if that's the case everywhere, but that's kind of my experience. Did that help? Did that answer?
That really helps a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. And I also wanted to thank people online for the excellent questions that are coming in. We have a question about pore space and CO2 sequestration in terms of liability. And the question is, are the Class 6 well operators the ones emerging as the key party in terms of liability?
So that is the last pillar that Wyoming was able to address from a legal perspective last year, Senate File 47, I believe, which talks about long-term stewardship and liability. And it puts in a long list of requirements that the Class 6 well operator and storage owner need to meet. But once those are met and there's a certificate of completion granted, 20 years after that, the long-term stewardship transfers to the state. And so the hope with that legislation was to put an end date to some of those things to assist with long-term financing. Investors would like to know that there's some cutoff date to that potential liability. And while there may be some potential liability, again, as a lawyer, may not be able to get rid of all of that, but this was Wyoming's attempt to try to put that to rest as much as we can. The requirements to get the certificate of completion in terms of monitoring and data collection is fairly significant. But the state felt comfortable that with those that list of things being met by the well owner and the monitoring of the plume, that the state was comfortable taking over long-term stewardship of those projects. And I'm not sure, Erin, maybe I'm not sure if any other states have really have done that last piece. Maybe Erin, but I think Wyoming might be the only one.
Kimberly, did you have something to add?
I think North Dakota's is a similar setup. And I think several states are doing that. Nick might be able to chime in, but it's kind of sectioned off. There's a period where the liability is going to remain with operator, but after a certain timing and a showing of completion that is checking all the boxes that the agencies are asking for, it's going to transfer to the state for that long term down the road.
I think you're right. I think a lot of the states that are working on rules or trying to get there now are using North Dakota and Wyoming as models of how we do this. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. And so, originally North Dakota's rules were based off the IOGCC model statute and rules that were done back in 2007. And you guys, or the committee you're on, you're involved in updating that right now. So hopefully we will have good models out there to work from.
Yeah, we're bringing that 2007 model forward. And so it's not even just a revamp of what's existing, but it's also additions, things that we've learned since 2007. And Nick contributes a great deal. And so hopefully we will be able to provide that at some point for states to look to. It is by no means going to be a one size fits all, because I just think that's an impossibility the way states are structured differently. But it will have not only just kind of here's our model, here's what we lay out for you, but we are also, I think, adding on what we call just considerations, things that you should also consider within your rules, regulations, and drafting procedures that we weren't comfortable necessarily trying to lay out as a blanket, but given your state's needs, you might want to incorporate.
I did have a question about whether the Wyoming's legal guidelines are available. Kara, have those been published?
Thanks, Sharon. We have several places probably where you can find that. The most comprehensive was the recent publication that we put out like 2 weeks ago. I don't know if I have the formal title, but it's basically pore space, interstate and federal pore space challenges. I'm happy to provide a link. I can send it to you, and perhaps you can put it in the chat or send it to the group. But that paper really summarizes those 6 pillars, how Wyoming has addressed that with statutory references. And then there's a chart for each one of the 6 pillars with comparisons to the other states, and then a section on the federal government at the end.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in is in terms of primacy, and how do we go about establishing what use gets primacy in a multi-use basin?
I'm not going to attempt that with 2 lawyers on my panel with me. I'm going to take that from a legal perspective.
Okay, read that again for me. Read that question again.
So the question is in terms of primacy. So if we have a multi-use basin, which use gets primacy in the basin? Is it in terms of which permit is approved first, or is there one industry that would have primacy over another?
So I think of primacy maybe a little too legally. I think it's taking jurisdiction away from the federal government and giving it to the state. So depending on what the state is granted in terms of primacy is kind of what Nick alluded to. Most states don't just go and ask for class 2. They tend to ask for class 2 and class 6 and maybe some class 5 or maybe, a multitude. Now, in terms of priority, I'm not certain. The traditional kind of legal viewpoint in terms of property rights would be, first in time, first in right of principles would apply there. So I separate kind of the primacy from priority. In terms of priority, I think you also have to consider dominancy. We automatically recognize that the mineral estate is a dominant estate. And so a state like Texas has not given us a rule to go by. And there's a lot of fights over who owns the pore space simply because the mineral owners want it and they think they're the dominant estate. And it was originally what held their resource. Surface owners want it for the various reasons of, well, there's a lack of resource now. It's empty. Give it to me. there's conflicts in the Texas laws about, in terms of laws, I mean case law. There's no statute or anything to look to, but the case law is kind of up and down on that. And so I think in terms of priority, you're going to have to address all of those things. It's going to be a first in time, first in right, because even if surface is first in time and first in right, they may be forced to accommodate a different estate. And then, so you look at the, first in time principles plus the accommodation, plus you're going to have to look at things like correlative rights. I don't think we're going to just plow forward without evaluating waste factors, whether it's economical waste or physical waste, but also the idea that are we harming our neighbors? What kind of impact are we having on the correlative rights? And so primacy in terms of getting that jurisdiction over the different resources, I don't know that comes with any more or less power than what the legislation grants, but priority in terms of evaluating it fully from a very broad perspective, I think is going to be a challenge.
So following up on that, in terms of determining waste and correlative rights, that requires a lot of geologic data and a lot of geologic study. Do we feel like we're ready to make those sort of determinations? Do we need more data? Do we need better access to the data that already exists because a lot of it is proprietary? Nick, do you have any thoughts along those lines?
Well, I said in my opening, I don't think we can ever have enough subsurface data. I mean, as geologists, we certainly always want more, right, Aaron? And you never have what you feel like is a totally comprehensive picture of the subsurface. So the more data we can get, the better off we are. And one of the things that we're going to be requiring in our rules is that any cores, any samples collected as part of a CO2 project, we get all of that data as well. And of course, any kind of seismic monitoring, anything like that would have to be reported to the board. Some maybe could be held proprietary, maybe some not. But certainly we need a lot more information than we have in some places. Some places we have a wealth of information where we've had a lot of drilling, a lot of cores taken, a lot of history. Over time, we know the parameters of the rocks. We know the characteristics. So, yeah, more data is better.
I think, too, that with data, you can also, it may be time for the legal and regulatory field to consider additional protections. We already put in setbacks and we have different, regulatory rules. We have private contracting mechanisms, PEW clause, a retained acreage clause. I think as we move forward, we should start taking some of those principles that we've used to protect things and advance them within this field as well. I can remember at one point I said, at some point we're going to need deeper PEW clauses. A 100-foot PEW clause from a wellbore is not going to work. Here we are in a horizontal realm where they drill under a vertical wellbore and they fracture into the wellbore above them. That's wellbore interference. That could have been resolved maybe with a little bit of a broader PEW clause or some other restriction that made a setback more different. So I think there's data that's, on the subsurface side that is definitely needed. I agree with Nick, the more the better. But I also think there's legal mechanisms too we need to start considering.
Great points. We did have a question about, it sort of relates to unitization and forced pooling, and it mentions that the plume space is defined by the pore space impact area, the plume itself from CO2 sequestration. And so the question was for Wyoming, does it require, how do we address the usage permission from the affected subsurface owners? And Kara, Nick, you can probably chime in on this as well. This is an issue of unitization and forced pooling.
So we haven't actually had one of those agreements yet, and so the statutory and regulatory framework is there. And I'm probably not a huge expert on this, but I would say that the requirements for unitization are, while they're modeled on oil and gas, are higher in terms of a percentage of landowners that must agree. But for those that don't, the provisions are fairly similar about how that works for the rest of them. I guess I'm not really sure what else to add to that at this point. Nick, I'd love for you to chime in and maybe fill in some gaps, but we're going to find out a lot more about this, I think, as we go forward. But we've got at least the basic framework in place.
We've had some big and controversial unitizations in Alabama. Anytime money's involved, you can get very controversial very quickly, of course. But the funny thing is, usually it's not the unitization itself that's the controversy, it's the formula for sharing that people really get engaged about. So, the concept of unitization is one that's well accepted, and everybody understands the necessity of unitizing an area and going through, an enhanced recovery process to get more oil out of the ground, because everybody benefits from that ultimately, that an interest owner there. But how the money's shared, and that's always the issue, and how that's going to work with CO2, because I don't think that really that comes into play for, from what I understand, most people aren't going to be looking at, exactly what your pore volume component is or where the CO2 goes within in an area. It's more going to be just, here's the plume, here's where it is.
So Nick, along those lines, how do we plan to actually monitor where that plume is and where it's going?
Well, I think there's been a lot of, as we've done CO2 enhanced oil recovery over the years, I think there's a pretty good knowledge base out there, particularly among some of the operators that have done this for a long time. I've seen some pretty impressive 4D seismic work that shows the plume as it evolves over time. And of course, monitoring wells to monitor the plume and to monitor groundwater resources and, make sure water quality is being maintained and underground sources of drinking water. I think the technology's out there to do that, to monitor the plume and have a fairly accurate idea of how things are evolving over time.
Since you brought up plume, Aaron, I was going to add that I know in my group, one of the things that has just been brought up in our task force is not necessarily just the plume, but the pressure that comes with the plume and it causing forced migration of other resources elsewhere. And then that creates that longer down the line liability chain that a lot of people are concerned about. And so I don't have a lot of answers on that because we are just starting to dig into that. But I will say there is a new article that has come out. It is from the International Journal of Greenhouse Gas Control, and it is addressing how you're going to be able to explore the area of review using it as kind of a screening tool for that pressure plume. I will send that to you so that it can get shared with the group.
Great, thank you. Well, we are closing in at the end of our session. So our final question for the session is a unified regulatory and permitting environment possible? And if so, what would that look like? Just a tiny question.
Unified as in all of the states adopting
all the states, all of the industries working together. Yes.
I think you're going to find too much variability around the states, that they all have their tradition of oil and gas development and other things. And I think they're going to model regulations for these other activities in the subsurface basically off of that history that they have. And, I think we're looking at primarily the same areas of states that have historically seen development. So, there's just a lot that's already there that's going to have to be built upon, is my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with Nick on that. I'm a big believer in states' rights, and that's one of the great things about our country. I do think there could be general agreement about pillars or, what are the main areas that need to be addressed. But each state does come at this a little bit different, as Nick said, with different types of experiences. And certainly these ideas and statutory language and all those things can always be improved. And so I like the idea of states continuing to experiment with those and continue to improve the language and the concepts around them. But it would be nice if we could have some general agreement about, what the basic pillars are, the different areas that a state needs to be sort of carbon capture ready.
And do you think the states are communicating to share their techniques and their policies?
Well, I think Kimberly's already mentioned that the IOGCC is one really good group where the states come together, basically the oil and gas regulators in the states, and then the Groundwater Protection Council, which is both oil and gas regulators and environmental regulators or groundwater regulators. And there are really robust discussions going on in both of those groups about all of these things. And I think that will continue.
Great. Any last thoughts before we close? Nope. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you sharing your valuable expertise on this topic. And it sounds like we are on our way to coordinating and coming up with some policies that, if they're not identical state to state, perhaps they are compatible. And that is very encouraging. So thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
So we will close this panel now and take a 30-minute break, and we will start at the top of the hour with our next panel. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tamika Searcy, Petroleum System Analyst, Geologist at BP, focusing on geomodeling, geochemistry, basin modeling, etc. We had a lovely first panel with discussions on permitting when it comes to multi-use basins. We're going to move on or continue with our next panel, which will be focused on environmental impacts, safety in multi-use basins. So we're joined to discuss that with Darren Diamani, Matthew Minnick, and Scott Anderson. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, give a 2-minute summary of what they think are the major concerns regarding environmental impacts and safety in multi-use basins, and where more scientific information or policy change is needed. So with that, Darren, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Darren Damiani. I'm the Carbon Transport and Storage Program Manager at DOE's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. I manage a portfolio of projects that are advancing technologies for geologic storage of captured CO2. Our program has actually been running since 2007, so we have over 2 decades of experience in developing technologies and monitoring technologies, modeling, and so forth. And I've been with, I'm actually an environmental engineer by training. I started my career in this since 2007. The National Energy Technology Laboratory. I was a federal project manager there. And I started headquarters as the program manager in 2015. So this particular webinar is incredibly timely, mainly because, as you all know, recently the bipartisan infrastructure law appropriated $2.3 billion for FECM, fossil energy carbon management, to manage, most of which that money is going to be used for expanding Carbon Safe. You've heard that earlier. Someone had mentioned Carbon Safe is Carbon Storage Assurance Facility Enterprise. It's a multi-year, multi-phase projects that are characterizing storage sites of 50 million metric tons or greater. Their work involves characterization, permit application, development, and then submitting application, and once getting the permit to construct, then move on to construction of injection wells, observation wells, and so forth. There's no injection involved in Carbon Safe. Those projects end once authorization to inject is granted by EPA, and then from that point, the operator takes over. But I say it's timely because $3 billion appropriated to our program, and all of this is to support the decarbonization goals of the administration being net zero by 2050, means that we're going to be standing up a lot more of these projects. And we're all very used to thinking of these projects in isolation. In fact, the permitting framework is built around a single project. Single project could have multiple wells, but as you've heard in earlier discussions, there is the area of review, which is, of course, the boundaries of the pressure plume, not just the CO2 plume. But then there's this, if we're to achieve these decarbonization goals, and then the acceleration of these projects has to be quite rapid, and therefore basins will start filling up with projects. So now it starts to become important from an environmental and safety standpoint. How does the basin respond to projects that are starting to unfold within a basin? What are the geomechanical impacts in what I've heard called the common space, those spaces in between projects? Clearly, the regulations don't allow projects to interfere with each other. They're not supposed to do that. There's no provision for that I'm aware of, so they need to stay away. So the question is, how close can they get? If everyone tries to play it safe and stays away from each other, well, then you leave a lot of stranded resources. So this question comes of, one, how do you do this efficiently and safely? And the other question is, what is happening on a basin scale in the case of, let's say, for example, induced seismicity? What's happening within all of these projects? Who's monitoring that? And there's no one. There's no one monitoring that. Everybody's monitoring their own projects. So that becomes a question. And just to give an example, pyroelastic forces are those forces that the rock feels, not the pressure within the pore spaces, but the rock itself. That transmits even further than the pressure plume. So does that create any risk of induced seismicity? And again, I'm only talking about storage, right? Just the CO2 storage. So having the ability to monitor that is something that we're very interested in at the DOE. We think is really important, obviously from the environmental and safety aspects. And of course, it has lots of implications from what was talked about earlier, competition for pore space rights, but from the environmental and safety standpoint, we need to have an understanding of what that is. Now throw in the mix of multi-use, where you have carbon storage and you have geothermal and you have oil and gas and all the ones that were talked about before. They all have regulatory frameworks in place, right, that address the environmental safety, but they're not consistent with each other. So when you get projects that are either in proximity to each other or perhaps even integrated, and integrated is actually something that's very interesting to DOE. It's this idea of, well, if you're going to drill a well, what can you get out of it? Just storage? Maybe there's other things. So, but it becomes kind of complicated. So from my perspective, from the storage program manager's perspective, it's of great interest to us to have an understanding of holistically how the basin is responding to this growth of projects. What does that mean in terms of resource availability? What does it mean in terms of how there's reactions between each other, even subtle ones? They're calling them interference, perhaps not in the regulatory framework, but in other ways. So that to me is, I think, really, really a key aspect of something that's of great interest to DOE, and I'm really, really pleased that we're having that this discussion on that. So with that, I'll pass it on to our next speaker.
Matthew, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Matthew Minnick, I work at a consulting firm, so a little bit different than everybody else here, a consultant with clients. With RESPEC, I manage the reservoir engineering group here. I have an international team, US and Canada-based engineers. Our main focus is geothermal and CCS. But we also work in gas storage, acid gas injection, saltwater disposal, thermal energy storage, and so forth. I have a PhD from Colorado School of Mines in geological engineering. I've been in about 17 years of experience in the business in geothermal, all over the world, New Zealand, South America, Central America, US, Canada, so forth. Chief reservoir engineer on a couple major geothermal development projects in Canada, the Deep Earth Energy Project and the 2D project in British Columbia. And then new projects, geothermal power and heat development in Texas, and hopefully North Dakota coming up here soon in the basins. Also have a DoD contract for thermal energy storage, shallow thermal energy storage, and then also looking at grid scale deep thermal energy storage, essentially for solar thermal energy. And then in the past 3 years, I've worked on quite a few CCS projects, reservoir engineering and modeling across Texas, Louisiana, Class 6 permit in Ohio, active projects in Wyoming right now, California, Minnesota actually, in a deep basalt, and then multiple projects in Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan, and due diligence on those projects as well with pore space issues and plume interference and so forth. And then some interesting acid gas injection projects too. Nobody mentioned this yet, but I've been asked a lot lately, how do we permit a acid gas injection well, which is a class 2, where 98% of the injectate is CO2, and you have 2% of your acid gas, and can we re-permit that as a class 6 well down the road? And what's the difference between a class 2 AGI well and a class 6 well? When you're largely at a CO2 plume, you're injecting. And then some interesting gas storage issues as well. A lot of these geothermal projects I've been on in these set basin type settings interact with potential hydrocarbons. Very interesting issues in BC with that, where we have rights holders to gas in a large carbonate reef, where the differentiation of the gas that's in the upper reef or the lower reef where the geothermal target isn't real clear. Who owns those rights? Looking at unitization, how do you work together? A lot of these projects are integrated projects, both geothermal, gas, CO2 storage, etc. And then also have experience worked on as a expert witness in some court cases related to plume migration and interaction between wellbores and so forth. So really dynamic situation in all these basins. And it's new. It's new issue with geothermal, with coming together with the hydrocarbons, coming together with storage of CCS or gas, all these things interacting. And so how do you navigate this, and how do the regulators navigate it? And then from a consulting perspective, how do I advise my clients and walk them through the issues when some of these are gray? We talked about in the other panel, not everything's defined real well. And so what are the risks of the projects from a private investment standpoint, right? As an investor, how do you want to navigate these things in the projects themselves? So lots of interesting things going on. In Texas as well, not just up in Canada with the gas. There's a lot of very high temperature deep basins there that contain gas. And so when you put in a big geothermal well and you're producing at 50,000 barrels a day, even if that reservoir from an economic or a simple gas well standpoint is depleted, there's going to be a lot of gas that wants to come up with that geothermal fluid. And so who owns that gas? It's not economic from a regular gas reservoir or gas production perspective, but there are some gas wells in it. Are you pulling their gas? Is it your gas? Whose gas is it? And how are you using that gas? How are you going to use it on the surface? Are you going to re-inject it? Are you going to use it for additional power generation? there is lots of many issues there. And then the other big one we talked about is pressure. To me, pressure is a resource, right? You know, we talk about these other things, but pressure really is a resource. From a geothermal standpoint, in a traditional geothermal field, pressure has a lot to do with your parasitics. Parasitics on your system, your pumping and your injection, all that's lost power. So you have your gross power production and then your net, and that pressure helps determine that. It's a resource from a geothermal standpoint. And then, of course, we talk about injectivity, right? And so pressure is an important part of that. And then up in Saskatchewan, been on several projects where we've done due diligence and interference between CCS and saltwater disposal. And so up there, deep in the Deadwood Formation, you have many potash mines up there that have deep water disposal, but they want to do CCS as well, and you have major CCS projects proposed in the area. How do they interact? You may not have plume interaction, but sometimes you do, and it's interesting how that interacts with the denser saltwater injection, but that pressure interaction, right? So you have operators up there that don't want to add pumping to their injection, but may have to if you have a big CO2 storage hub that then pressurizes the formation, and now they're having to spend money on additional pumping to get their injection in from an operation standpoint. So yeah, lots of issues out there. Interesting kind of Wild West frontier from my perspective. So I invite you, any questions? Again, I do a lot in geothermal and in many other areas, so it's kind of an interesting crossover.
Fantastic, Matthew. Let's move on to the next panelist for his 2-minute. Scott, thank you.
So I'm Scott Anderson. I'm with Environmental Defense Fund in the Texas office. I had a long career in oil and gas before coming to EDF. I was the general counsel and executive vice president of the trade association that represents independent producers and royalty owners in Texas. I've been a member of IOGCC since 1984, and I'm working with Kimberly from the first panel on the revision of the IOGCC model. I'm leading a subgroup on the liability and long-term stewardship issue. I've also been working with Groundwater Protection Council since the early 80s. That's the group that Nick too mentioned he's the current president of. Back when I first came to EDF, I was hired to build alliances with EOR producers in order to demonstrate CCS in the EOR context. And during those first few years, I worked with not only IOGCC and GWPC, but also the World Resources Institute and API, and a self-organized group called the Multi-Stakeholder Discussion. And all of those entities sort of pooled their ideas and evolved their ideas and became quite influential on EPA when it was drafting its Class 6 rules. So I come at this with perspective of someone who works on geologic sequestration of CO2, though I've also had exposure to oil and gas operations, wastewater and acid gas injections, gas storage, and hydrogen storage. And in brief, my major concern is pressure interference among projects. A number of the pending Class 6 permits at EPA actually already have overlapping AORs. So this is not necessarily an issue of the future. It's also an issue for right now. And this issue, of course, can be compounded if other types of projects also either add or subtract to these pressure footprints of the sequestration projects. The overlapping pressure footprints and interference can cause various problems. Potentially, that includes increasing the risk of CO2 escaping containment or the pollution of groundwater. I think those things can be managed, but only if they are managed. Similarly, these pressure contributions from nearby projects can increase the risk of seismicity. Again, I think that's something that can be managed, but only if it is managed. And then finally, economic impacts, which I believe can also be characterized as environmental or resource impacts. Lower injectivity or higher cost of injection, as was just mentioned. The reduced value of the pore space, because your pressure headroom is value. And if somebody else is making use of that by having their pressure infiltrate your project, then the value of your property's gone down, and because you can store less in your property. And then so I've already made the other point, which is that you can characterize those kind of things, which are the economic impacts, either as simply economic impacts or as things that undermine the efficiency of the use of the subsurface resource, the subsurface pore space. As for improvements in scientific knowledge and needed policy changes, three things come to mind readily. One is how to calculate zones of elevated pressure and assess their significance when there are multiple projects driving the pressure changes. That's really not something that the Class 6 rules address, although they do require projects to analyze their own zones of elevated pressure, and that's how people know that there are already pending projects out there that have overlap. A second improvement would be improved techniques for identifying abandoned wells that are not in the public record, but that penetrate the AORs of CO2 projects. And then finally, a thing that comes to mind immediately is that the need to take pressure interference into account in unitization rules and decisions. And in decisions on the size of leases, basically how much pressure space or pressure buffer is needed around a project in order to prevent or minimize negative effects. But as we also just heard, if you overdo it, you can also impact the efficient use of resources by having projects that are more widely separated than they really need to be. So that's also a policy issue that needs to be grappled with. And I would join Kimberly from the first panel in commending to your review a recent paper by Alex Bump and Sue Avorka of the Bureau of Economic Geology on AOR's legacy wells and what they call pressure space as distinct from pore space.
Excellent. You all actually have highlighted quite a few risks when it comes to subsurface technology regarding multi-use within basins. But I did want to give the space. There was a question that was asked if anyone else wanted to highlight any other environmental impact or safety risk when it comes to multi-use basins. You know, it's been highlighted on the pressure regime as well as the economic values, degradation, but and interactions with fluids. Any other ones? Darren, maybe, did you want to highlight any other risk when it comes to environmental impact or safety risk?
I think within the geologic storage space, our biggest concerns are leakage and geoseismicity. CO2 in its free phase is buoyant when you inject that. So wellbore integrity is incredibly important, and having a good understanding of the geomechanics of the cap rocks, typically multiple cap rocks if possible. But those are the main two that are of concern to us. So the leakage issue is something that is addressed through the Class 6 regulations by monitoring the above zone interval. That's the interval that's above the cap rock. You're looking at perturbations in temperature and pressure. If you have a good understanding of what the background changes are, because remember, the subsurface is always dynamic. It's very slow, but it does change. There are changes in pressure. There's changes in there's velocity to that water. Again, very slow, but it's there. So having an understanding of what is nominal versus what is actually perturbed, that doesn't have to be CO2. It could be a pressure change. It could be a change in brine. So that's important to monitor those things as an indication of leakage. Dew seismicity is the other big one, and that's a little bit tougher. But this has been brought up, pressure being a resource. In dew seismicity, microseismicity is also useful information. And we've seen this in the Arthur Daniels Midland project. In fact, Sally Greenberg's presentation showed a series of blue dots all around. Those are the microseismic events. If you notice, they were clustered. So these are highlighting features. They're geologic features, possibly faults or fracture networks, right? You can use that information then to give you more characterization about what you're injecting into it. In fact, it influenced their next project. So that this is from the Illinois Basin Indicator Project. That was a research project. Then there was the ADM Industrial Sources Project, where they did a higher amount of CO2, up to 1 million tons per year. They changed their injection interval based on that information, the microseismic data, to stay away from the crystalline basin rock. That's the pressure migrate. That's where the bigger events typically happen, right? It's going to be there. So they moved up. Mount Simon's massive. It's 1,600 feet. It's huge, but there are varying degrees of porosity and permeability. So they moved it up into a highly porous lens that was then, with a baffle below that, was just a lower permeability lens that kept pressure from migrating down. So, what looks like something that should make everybody nervous turns out to be really valuable information that we use to make decisions. And particularly, it's an engineered system. You've heard brine extraction or water extraction. So it's a method of controlling pressure. If you don't pressure up, you pull water out, pressure comes back down again. So it's interesting in that it's not like you just inject and forget. There are solutions and ways of controlling where you want to do various things. But sorry, that was a very long answer to your question of
No.
It's the leakage and dew seismicity, right? Those are the two main ones.
Oh, you highlighted with risk, there is some value of information that you get out of an event.
Correct.
Thank you. Before I move forward with the Q&A, I did want to highlight to the online guests that you are able to submit questions to the panelists on our webpage live stream. Look for the Slido box underneath the live stream video. But to continue on with the induced seismicity, it's brought up several times for the open audience. We wanted to highlight, can you describe to us industries who should be concerned about induced seismicity? And with that list of industries, what have you all seen any best practices from industries that used it, as well as what can we learn from the wastewater injection that you just spoke about, Darren?
I can jump in there. So from the experience with wastewater injection, I think the lessons include, go back prior to our experience with earthquakes caused by wastewater injection. Most of the seismicity that was caused historically was more from production than it was from withdrawal. So that can still happen, but that's not really what people are focused on right now, thanks to the growth in wastewater injection seismicity. But from that, one lesson has already been mentioned, and that is you really don't want your pressure or your fluids going down to the crystalline basement. And another thing is that rates and volumes are better predictors of problems than than people used to think. It's not just about frac pressure. It's it's volumes and rates as well. As far as best practices go, I would point to two things. One is a primer. It's now in its third edition, I believe, drafted under the auspices of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and the Groundwater Protection Council. It's a primer on induced seismicity for regulators. It was originally written in response to these fluid injection, wastewater injection quakes, but it now also includes an appendix on induced seismicity associated with CCS. The other thing I would point to, although it has a lot of problems, is an existing rule in California. It's part of the CARB's CCS protocol to the LCFS credit program. Its basic idea is pretty good, but it's not. But it needs to be modified to become more practical and useful. But what they basically say is you need to monitor your microseismicity and do a risk analysis. And if you determine that you have significantly, whatever that means, elevated the risk of quakes happening, that would be above a 2.7, which in most cases is a little bit below the minimum necessary for the public to feel it and get alarmed and for newspaper reporters to start writing stories. If you've significantly, based on your microseismicities analysis, if you've significantly raised the risk of going above 2.7, then mitigation is required.
I would jump in there and say, historically, at least from a geothermal perspective, the geysers field in California, they have a sort of the red light, green light, stoplight sort of system there. So they are causing induced seismicity there, both thermal, well, mainly thermal, not from a mechanical standpoint. If you want to find the geysers field, you just go on the USGS earthquake map and find the cluster of events just north of the Bay Area there, and you can find the geysers field. And so they've, taken a standpoint. We're going to cause it. We know what we're causing induced seismicity, but we have a system in place to help control it and mitigate the effects. And so I think the same thing to a certain degree goes with CCS and other projects in the sense of, if you listen to any of Mark Zobak's commentary lately, it's not if, it's when. I think a CCS project causes some sort of significant microseismic event, whether the public feels it or not. And so there's going to be optics around that. And so having a plan in place, monitoring that is so important, especially when we get, again, not just isolated projects, but lots of projects together. Whose fault is it if an earthquake happens? Who's the liability? Who's monitoring the background seismicity? The same thing played out helping with some geothermal projects up in Saskatchewan. Did some then do seismicity studies, and then of course with some of the interactions with the saltwater disposal and potential CCS hubs up there. Again, gathering the background information, and then being able to monitor forward who is liable for those events if they do happen in the RFL. Those are issues.
Yeah, Tamika, and if I could just really quickly add, we don't have the capability to predict earthquakes, but we're developing and advancing technology that can forecast induced seismicity risk. There's been tremendous advancements there, and especially with artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's some fantastic examples of the chatter before an actual slip that caused it has encoded in it the information that will tell you when it will happen. That happens in the lab. That's an actual earthquake prediction. But it demonstrates that there is information that we're not using that can help us forecast better induced seismicity. And again, as I said, these smaller events, we can use that information but we want to avoid the bigger belt events. So we're making investments, I'm sure others, in that forecasting capability. Is that kind of red light, green light you heard? When are you going too far? You can forecast out and say, if you continue going in this direction, you're elevating your risk and do seismicity. You should do something different from an operational standpoint. So those technologies are at Los Alamos is one, Lawrence Livermore. They're doing fantastic work in that space.
Excellent. There was a question on clarity on an acronym that has been put out here, AOR. So first, if someone can quickly define that for us, AOR. And then if you can move into the question of, are there various geologic concerns articulated by the panelists being adequately incorporated into the various AOR plumes spread impact commuter modeling? So impacting the commuter, yeah.
Yeah, so AOR stands for Area of Review, and this is one of the fundamental requirements of the Underground Injection Control Program, which regulates various types of injection wells. And here we're mainly talking about Class 6, although Class 2 also has areas of review. And an area of review, now I just limit it to Class 6. There's a vulnerability assessment framework that EPA developed that basically is used in order to map a project's area of review. And what you're looking for is how far can brine be displaced at a pressure that if the brine or CO2 were to encounter a fast path to the surface, either a transmissive fault or an unplugged wellbore, that there be enough pressure to lift either the water or the CO2 up into a higher drinking water aquifer. So that's what it is. It's also important to know that during the course of a project, based on your monitoring results, it's possible that you might be required to reconfigure your AOR based on experience. The biggest single reason, is, at least historically, why the UIC program requires people to delineate their AORs is the problem of unplugged wells. So if once you have your AOR defined, the rules require you to search at least the public records, and sometimes there's regulatory pressure to go beyond that, but at least the public records to identify unplugged wells that penetrate the storage site or bottom in the storage site. And if you have such a thing, you don't get a permit unless somebody, maybe you, takes care of those older penetrations. So that's what an AOR is. And yes, it has to do a lot. I forget now the second part of the question, but yeah, it has a whole lot to do with computer modeling.
Yeah, and so I would add to that, there's the pressure component, like Scott explained very eloquently there. And then there's the plume itself portion of it and the migration of the plume. So you have two things working together. Sometimes your AOR is mainly described by your pressure. Sometimes it's by the plume, or vice versa, depending on your plume migration. And it's a little different too for the different classes as well, whether you're a Class 6 or Class 1. Class 1, you're required, if it's hazardous waste, you're required to model a 10,000 year plume migration. And that ends up being part of your area review versus Class 6, where your migration is defined by where does that plume come in equilibrium after you stop injection with the formation? Where does it stop migrating? So that's your plume AOR at that point. Like Scott said, it changes over time as you re-permit things and you actually put in your historic injection. That can change your plume and your knowledge of the subsurface too. So there's a lot that goes into that. And so you try to be real conservative with your models and the input parameters that go into it. So you're forcing your AOR out farther than maybe you think it actually is. And so you're being on the safe side, potentially including more area to review for your permits.
And from a basin perspective, that could be really, really important, that buffer space. As Scott pointed out, and correct me if I'm wrong, the permitting process is actually iterative once you're in the operation, right? You have to revisit your area review and your modeling. You do history matching because you've got observation wells, right? And so you try to match what your models are saying. If your model is suddenly saying, well, actually everything's moving that way, does that impact my area review? And then I might have to change that, And now to what extent that's going to be very common, I don't really know. But it does mean now that your area review has the potential of moving. So now your neighbor could be moving. Now you've got area reviews that are could be moving around each other. From a basin perspective, that's really important, and that's why that buffer that makes people cautious and they will move away from each other. Now you're potentially stranding resources there. And also, if you start ejecting, maybe you're changing the in situ stress of the rock. I did a characterization well. I measured my in situ stress. Then 3 years later, because it takes a while to get a permit, it's changed a little bit because your neighbor project was stressing the rock. I mean, we don't know this. I'm conjecturing here a little bit, but these are the questions that are becoming really important in how this industry, and again, I'm talking just about storage, and I'm sorry, I know this is multi-use, but how is that industry going to evolve? How do we monitor that? We need to be able to understanding of how that works so that we can provide information to operators who have their own interests. We understand that, and that's fine. But somehow we have to share that so that this is all done, in a way where everybody kind of knows what's happening and what if there's any changes to risks. So just wanted to add that one last time.
Yeah, I would also add, as from a consultant and a client perspective, obviously you want to minimize your area view, but you want to be conservative on the other side, that you want to be able to get your permit. The other issues there are plume migration and where you injected in what zones and how many sands and the injectivity of those sands. So often we've run into issues or projects where we've had to, from a modeling perspective, what I call come up with designer plumes. And so we modify how much volume and rates go into various sands and to minimize migration and minimize pressure buildup. And so it's interesting, not always the best, thickest, highly permeable sand is the best, especially if you have a dip. Actually, thinner sands with lower transmissivity, if you can take on the injectivity, are actually better to help contain your plume.
Yes, I would say something that I'm not positive this is a difference of opinion. It might be. I wouldn't say that minimizing the AOR should be the goal of project developers. They certainly should hope to have a minimum sized AOR, but once they've made a site, once they've selected a site, it's really in your interest, as Matt, as you already said, to be conservative, and because a developer is not doing themselves any favors if they successfully get an AOR that's too small, and then it turns out once they're into the middle of the project that they're having extra costs and complications and potentially liabilities because they got an AOR that was too small.
Yeah, exactly. So there's trade-offs. Sometimes it comes down to if you bump your AOR another half mile, now you've captured another 500 wells that you have to go and check and so forth. So
So you hope you don't have to do that, but you may have to do that, and it may be in your interest to do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for that person who asked about the definition of AOR, it's that area where you have to do your monitoring. So a bigger area of interest, area of review means bigger monitoring. It means, and a seismic footprint, it's very expensive. So there's an interest in keeping it as small as possible, but not too small, as Scott just pointed out.
Man, the time is going really, really fast. I realized I didn't span to the committee to ask them any one question at least. There is one. I actually have three in my head, but clearly I'm being cut off. But when it comes to monitoring or modeling, in the oil and gas industry, we use seismic to distinguish fluids in the subsurface. How confident are you seeing examples really from the modeling aspect of we can put in the plumes, but really how confident have you seen technology come to really know what the extent is.
I can give you a real quick example of where the seismic imaging, 4D seismic, doesn't work very well. And that's when you inject into a formation that's very thin. This happened in Mount Simon, where you have this large interval of injection, but most of the CO2 is going in this one. It's the path of least resistance. It becomes a very thin disk. That's hard to image because seismic imagery is only resolution is quite thick, right? So it doesn't work in every case. Big thick plume, yeah, you'll see that. Thinner plumes comes harder.
Yeah, I've been told that somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 tons of CO2 clumped together is sort of the minimum threshold for being able to detect it on a 3D.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. The other issues come up too, with risk and investors, and how are you verifying your containment and volume of CO2 for your 45Q credits below ground? And the cost of that, and does 4D seismic work, and how much is that going to cost me versus some monitoring wells, and who decides what is enough, what's sufficient?
Real quickly, another reason for history matching and computational modeling is so you can be ready for your end game when you're trying to get post authority to close a site. You have to be able to have good enough demonstrated predictive capacity in your model in order to have the regulator agree that not only are you not leaking now, but you're not going to leak in the future either.
Aaron, yeah. My final question, I think, lended its way to the documentation with the 4D example and others that highlighted from that. But Aaron, from the panel, from the committee, actually has a question.
Thank you, Tamika. I guess I was building on what we just discussed in the last panel about liability. Someone raised the point of liability in the case where you have these multi-use basins, and how what's been permitted under one set of conditions, the liability that you've accepted under one set of conditions can change when you add additional industries or additional wells or injection. And how would you go about unraveling responsibility in terms of liability?
So that's one of those it depends cases. It can be really, really challenging, but there's probably nothing more challenging than figuring that out in where seismicity is concerned. But it's definitely can be challenging. The more fundamental question, and if I had been on the other panel, I would have already said this, is whether people should be relieved of normal liability at closure or not. We believe strongly that they should not. We're not really advocating new special rules of liability, but we think normal rules of liability should continue to apply in the CCS space until normal statutes of limitation have run. And keeping people responsible for their mistakes encourages good behavior. Relieving people of responsibility for mistakes encourages the opposite. It's also terrible public relations to try to tell the public, don't worry, we know what we're doing, CCS is safe and effective, and by the way, when it isn't, then the operators want to be excused from liability.
Great. Well, we are wrapping up on time, and I would like to thank the panelists. Great session on describing your concerns around environmental impacts as well as safety risk for multi-use basins. Just highlighted takeaways for me was the clear need of pressure monitoring as well as pressure prediction, right? And knowing your limitation when it comes to 3D subsurface monitoring, modeling the subsurface, and then continuing to work on that. Maybe even stressing we have several operators out there, and just really ensuring that we're challenging the system when it comes to a governing body, right? people are kind of self-sourcing and kind of working in their own space, but ensuring that we develop a space for a governing body or at least someone monitoring the activities in the multi-use basins. With that, I'm going to close this panel, and we're going to give us about 13 minutes of break time and return back for another panel. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue our conversation with our final panel, which is focused on collaboration and communication. We've invited back our panelists from the earlier two panels. We're not going to ask them to reintroduce themselves, but we're going to ask them to begin by asking each of them to highlight what they think are the biggest needs and opportunities in the area of collaboration and communication, and how might we encourage those conversations. So just to repeat, the biggest needs and opportunities for collaboration and communication, and how we might encourage those conversations. And if each of you could just take 2 or 3 minutes to address that, and I'm going to ask Kimberly to start.
Hi, I think the two big ones for me is, working with the IOGCC state collaboration among state regulatory agencies has been probably the forefront, driving our task force initiative. Nick's kind of mentioned it in one of the panels. I think Scott's mentioned it. It's a very large group of state representatives, oil and gas attorneys, oil and gas council members, environmental specialists. We work in conjunction with EPA and with, Groundwater Protection Council. So I've always kind of taken the viewpoint of, the more the better, right? I think Nick said that earlier, that the more that will join and contribute, I think the better toolbox we have to assess from and kind of pull things from. We also have some states that have kind of pioneered the way. Being able to work with those states has been extremely beneficial for us, whether it's been through their successes or maybe their setbacks. Either way, it's been learning opportunities. So I think, state collaboration continues to be a forefront for us. On the other side of that, just from my personal attorney hat that I wear, a lot of my practice revolves around landowners, and the lack of education there is a big hurdle just for me. Getting them to understand what they're looking at and what we're trying to accomplish here can be overwhelming. So I think some need for public involvement and collaboration would be warranted and probably well received. So I will pass on to the next.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. Kara, how about you next?
Well, it's hard to add much to what Kimberly suggested. I think she did a really nice job there of summarizing a lot of the opportunities. I would just say from our perspective in Wyoming and from School of Energy Resources perspective specifically, we have an outreach function where we try to make sure everyone is aware of the projects that we're working on, many in this space. But it's really a twofold opportunity for us. It's one to share what we're doing, but it's also an opportunity for us to collaborate and learn from others. And so we really try to engage all of the directors of the centers, everyone on our teams, regionally, nationally, to make sure we are aware of what's happening, that we're adding to our best practices, and that we're sharing our information.
Thank you, Kara. Nick?
Yes, again, I'd like to just echo what Kimberly said about the IOGCC and the Groundwater Council. I think these are extremely effective means of communication among the states and all the other stakeholders that participate in those meetings, industry folks, federal government officials, others, just a wide-ranging group, and I think it's just a very effective way of communicating. I think we're all going to be faced with challenges in terms of public outreach. And of course, environmental justice plays into all of this as well, which is something that we all have to be aware of. And I'm heartened to see that most of the federal funding opportunities that are coming out have an element of public outreach and environmental justice, both DOE programs and recently announced Class 6 grant program from the US EPA. I think that provides a real opportunity to get out on the ground and make communities familiar with what's going on and make them understand what's going to be happening in their neighborhoods, how they're affected. I think another challenge that we have is engaging with local decision makers. I had the opportunity last week to go down to Baldwin County, Alabama, and meet with the environmental committee of the Baldwin County Commission, and they were hungry for information about CO2 projects, the CO2 project that has been announced in their county. So I think that we all should take advantage of every opportunity we can to get out there and speak with folks. And I think we'll find audiences in areas that are familiar with oil and gas operations and other similar things. Natural gas storage will be very receptive. They're a little easier to talk to. They have some experience, but we're all going to have to deal with people that just don't have any experience at all with any of these subsurface activities. And we're going to have to visit with them and make sure they understand, make sure they know that, it can be done safely and effectively, but every industrial operation has a risk. And I think we have to communicate those risks as well. And so some of the things I see.
Very good. Thank you, Nick. Darren, how about you next?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely want to echo what I heard some of the other panelists said. As Nick had pointed out, he's absolutely correct. There are funding opportunity announcements that DOE is releasing do require community benefits plans and Justice 40 plans and a whole host of community engagement to demonstrate that the communities are part of the stakeholder group, have a seat at the table, and have input into solutions for carbon management. And of course, our strategic engagement folks are also doing a lot of outreach and workshops, particularly just recently in Houston and Louisiana, which is kind of a hotspot right now. And it's interesting, the concerns that we're hearing. There's some misinformation, but also truly legitimate concerns about how this is going to impact them, not just storage itself, but is CCS in general enabling bad actors, polluters in their what they believe to be polluters in their region of water and air. So that's another concern. It's kind of indirect. It's like I'm not as worried about the CO2 storage. I'm worried that you're going to continue to have industries do the polluting that we've been trying so hard to address. So lots of questions like this. I agree. There's going to be challenges, but we're out there now, mostly listening. We want to understand what it is that people's concerns are. It's interesting what their perceptions are of what the geologic storage of CO2 is. So we know that there's an education component to it that's also going to be really, really important. But I want to mention one other really important aspect of collaboration that is truly multi-use within basins, and that is cross-cutting opportunities in the subsurface. We have a group here at DOE called the Subsurface Energy Innovations Crosscut. And the point of that is to say, well, we're all interested. This is geothermal, this is oil and gas, it's carbon storage, it's hydrogen, and all those offices that have programs within the subsurface getting together and saying, what do we do? We're all working in silos. What can we do in terms of information exchange or leveraging so that we get better use of taxpayer dollars? Because in the end, that's really what our responsibility is, to use the best use of taxpayer dollars. So this group is looking at, just for example, and I kind of mentioned it before, if you drill a borehole, you can get information that is of value to rare earth elements, to storage, to geothermal. So we're starting to think about this in terms of, if there's going to be drilling for characterization wells, we should be thinking about what information we can collect. These are all data points for all of these various programs. So within DOE, that collaboration then can help us focus on those aspects that are important to all of us. And if we all invest a little bit in that, that's a great savings for each of our programs, as opposed to us all trying to tackle that. Basically the same problem. It's just a matter of communicating among ourselves. So it sounds easy. It's not. it's hard, particularly within the government, because there's turf wars and there's money can only be used for certain things, right? There's mandates about what you can spend money on. So, but we're working through it and we're getting, we're starting to make some progress there. So just want all of you to know that within the government, this cross-cutting initiative is very germane to this multi-use within Basin. So just wanted to make sure that all of you folks knew that the government is thinking in those terms as well.
Thank you, Darren.
Sure.
Same question for you, Matthew.
Yeah, I'd second everybody's comments here. But a few things maybe from my perspective. One, I'll just piggyback off of Darren for a second here, those kind of cross-cutting relationships and integrated projects. The ones I have been on, and from a private investment standpoint, I think we are doing a pretty good job of collecting data across, multiple resources, especially in the geothermal lithium space. So lithium brines and hot geothermal brine, oil and gas data, geomechanics, hydrogen, helium, for example, in some of the geothermal projects, and CCS, CPG, CO2 plume geothermal, using the CO2 as a working fluid for geothermal power production. That's another one. And so I think there's just a lot of interest in this, especially when, from an investment standpoint, when maybe one resource or the other can't stand on its own from an economic standpoint. But if you're able to produce multiple resources or things from a series of wells that make the project viable or economic, that's hugely important. So I think having clarity across the states, and then from the federal standpoint, from what tests should be done, is important. And that'll jump into my next kind of point is clarity, right? Clarity across from the states and from a federal standpoint on monitoring what needs to be done, what do I have to do, what should I do, etc. From having that clarity and certainty is hugely important when I go into a project or I'm advising a client. And it's a little bit difficult right now, and I know just based off of experience what kind of recommend, and working with the regulators, especially potentially over in Wyoming, they're doing a great job of these things. But it's different by state or EPA region. So that's what I see.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Collaboration and communication, Scott Anderson, what do you have to say?
I have three opportunities in mind. First one is fostering coordination among operators to identify and minimize and manage pressure interference among projects. And as to how to go about encouraging that, my thought is that it may be something that won't happen unless it's required by regulation. And there's two reasons I say that. One is just the natural, deep-rooted competitive instincts of the project developers, but then the other is real concerns about the antitrust implications that might be there for talking about such things and jointly managing them. The second opportunity I have in mind is, that I mentioned before, is improved oversight and management of induced seismicity risk. I mentioned the existing rule out in California is good at a high level, but it needs a lot of important adjustments. I did not mention that my group EDF and Occidental Petroleum have developed proposed changes in that LCFS protocol that we think would be good both from a developer perspective and from a seismicity prevention perspective. And we are beginning to talked with regulators in several other states about doing something along the lines that we have proposed in California. But I think I would emphasize, though, that this needs to be rules at the state level. We've didn't seem to have any disagreement over the idea that what we really need to avoid is felt earthquakes, any earthquake that's going to alarm the public or cause even minor property damage. But EPA's jurisdiction over induced seismicity under the Safe Drinking Water Act is limited to earthquakes that are so big that they could actually compromise containment. So I think this is a regulatory area that's really more suited for the states than it is the feds. So I would say the way to get there is to focus mainly on the states. And then the third opportunity is related to that first one on pressure management, but we need to develop a common understanding of how much of a pressure space buffer is enough and how much might be too much. Because if they're too small, the impacts will be worse. And if they're too big, the cost will go up and there's a risk of having stranded resources in between projects. Oh, and how to go about that? I think that scientists need to take a look at this. I think it's also tailor-made for some work by IOGCC and GWPC, also EPA and DOE, and the National Academy of Sciences.
Well, here we are. Thank you, Scott. So thank you all for your comments. Now we're going to move into the question and answer section of this part of the meeting. But first, a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions to the panelists on our webpage live stream. Look for the Slido box underneath the live stream video. So the first question is, do we have any good examples of where multi-use of the subsurface has worked well from a variety of perspectives? So we're looking for some real world examples. Anyone have any? Aaron.
I mean, I can think of a simple one. It was something that was done recently, and this kind of relates to what I was talking about earlier about wells. We knew our geothermal colleagues were drilling a deep 15,000-foot well. I think it was led by WVU in the Appalachian region. And we talked with them and said, hey, if you're going to go and drill all that depth, there's some great potential storage intervals that we would like to core. So as they drilled, then we kind of took over and we cored those areas that are of interest to us on the data point for the storage piece, and then they just continued on to do their work. So that's a really simple example, but I think it demonstrates that if we just think for a second, things like that can grow and get bigger. So we got two things for the price of one. We did pay for our piece of it and they paid for theirs. So, our thought is, how do we expand that? Again, I recognize that's a kind of a simple, but for the government, that's difficult. I mean, that can be a difficult thing to collaborate jointly like that. So we're looking for more opportunities for that. But maybe it's good that I start off with a really simple case and perhaps my colleagues can think of something more complex than that.
Well, I think that was good, Darren. And it wasn't in the U.S., but in Saskatchewan, I had a geothermal company and a lithium exploration company, and they collaborated in the cost of drilling some wells and collecting data, collecting lithium brine data and getting the temperature data. And so it benefited both. Very good example of that. And I think we might see some more of that in like Texas or other areas where you have those dual resources.
And were these the industry just recognizing the value of collaboration? There was no regulatory involvement?
Yeah, no regulatory involvement. And in this case, it worked well because the lithium resource was shallower than the geothermal. So they drilled partly down, took their samples, and then the well was drilled deeper for the geothermal data. So they weren't really conflicting with each other. So that made it a little bit easier.
Okay, thanks. Any other examples from other parts of the country or elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, David, I've got one. We have, of course, an extensive coal bed methane industry in Alabama, and some of that actually shares the same footprint as underground mining. And so usually the mine safety aspects kind of trump the coal bed methane production aspects of things. And so we have to have a little regulatory flexibility here to respond to the needs of the coal mines, to protect the miners and the communities that overlie or surround those coal mines as well. So we, had to, in some cases, maybe bend the rules is not the right terminology, but we've had to at least have some flexibility within our overall regime to make things work. And I think one example that we probably all have that we don't need to overlook, and that is groundwater production and use in areas of oil and gas operations. That's a very obvious one. But, in our coastal plain, again, we have extensive use of groundwater for public water supply, for agricultural purposes, for domestic use. And then we have, oil field operations drilling through those groundwater resources all the time. And we take very seriously the protection of those groundwater resources, but certainly a multi-use of the subsurface.
Thank you, Nick. Next question. What are the best forums or venues or approaches for bringing the different industries together to collaborate on the subsurface issues? We've heard about the IOGCC and how a lot of issues are dealt with just by regulators speaking to each other. Question from me, actually, does the IOGCC, actually, it's the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, do they actually have carbon management, carbon capture, carbon storage in their charter, or is that just something that happened organically?
I think it's organic.
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. I think it's just organically.
The charter was written in the 30s.
I see.
And it's a mandated charter, so you have to go back to the legislature to get it changed, the U.S. legislature.
And so for us, it was our committee was polled, and that was the top project selection for our committee to start working on. So we don't just haphazardly pick topics. We pool our representatives from the states and take about 2 to 3 different topics and try to tackle them every year to 2 years.
In the last meeting of IOGCC in Park City, Utah, someone, I don't recall who, noted that in recent years, they've seen more and more non-oil and gas issues coming up for discussion. So it's definitely evolving organically, I think.
Well, would it make sense then to go to Congress and have the charter expanded?
Depends on whether they repeal the charter or not.
Okay.
You know how it is. You never want to open that legislation unless you have to.
Unless you know what's going to happen.
Okay, maybe we'll just leave it organic for now. I see one of our committee members has their hand up. Erin, you have a question?
I do. Thank you, David. I guess I was thinking some comments were made about gathering data and collaborating in terms of gathering data. And I was thinking that really access to subsurface data is so important to the success of all of these industries, but we don't have sort of a national unified requirements for data reporting and public access. It's sort of on a state-to-state basis. Does anyone have any thoughts about how that might be managed, or ideally how we could have this national access to data as they are collected?
Well, I certainly agree. It's very, very important to get a lot of logs and cores into the public domain and other geologic, geophysical information. in 1983 is when Texas passed a statute requiring people who drill oil and gas wells to turn in electric logs. I noticed Nick mentioning that in their upcoming CCS rule, it sounds like they're going to be requiring that. The first step might be, because I've never done this, first step might be to survey all the states to see what is in effect right now. There's no doubt that there's lots of differences, and there may be some glaring omissions in some places. And if one were to, I think it'd be smarter to do that first before immediately jumping to the idea that that there should be federal action to compel it.
I wanted to jump in and make a comment real quick here too. Often it seems in projects we're data rich and data poor at the same time, in the sense of, especially in geothermal, where there seems to be a lot of data on these basins, at least from an oil and gas perspective, but the data they often collect or how they collect it is not always what we need from our end from a geothermal perspective. Like, we're really interested in the temperature, and so getting long-term equilibrated temperature logs or other things are really important, where the oil and gas community is not so important. So there's different targets and crossovers between what data is important to each one of these uses.
This is actually a really good time to bring up a new initiative that DOE is going to launch late in 2024. You'd all heard about Carbon Safe, but because of this interest, our interest now in understanding and monitoring basins, basin scale issues with regard to storage, we're going to launch something called Carbon Base. Carbon Base stands for Carbon Basin Assessment and Storage Evaluation, which is basically everything you're talking about. And this is multi-million dollar, tens of millions of dollars, multi-year projects to collect data, geologic data, mainly for filling data gaps where, data is sparse, because we heard from Nick, you never have enough data. So some of this effort is to fill that data, but then to collect that data and make it available in some sort of repository. We haven't figured that out yet, but making that data available, and then using that information as well as other public information, or basically any information we can get, to start developing tools that can look at basin in this respect. Now, again, this is for storage, but you understand that this can be applied to multiple uses. But the idea is that, and I don't know who would be doing the monitoring system, but if we start to take that information and start studying what the basin, how the response the basin is to storage, then that will help us, and planners, and it could be many stakeholders, could use that information for projects going forward, as more and more start to be set up. But that's also, and we're open to that cross-cutting collaboration, meaning, well, if DOE is going to go out and start, drilling holes in various basins and doing stratigraphic wells, doing characterization wells, well, there's that opportunity again to start thinking about, well, what other information can we get from those wells that are of value and of use to other programs and other interests. So just want to let you know that's something that's in the planning. We haven't nailed the concept down yet completely. I mean, we'd like to think we could have as much money as we want thrown at, but of course, Congress only gives us so much funding. So we're trying to strategize on how this concept will develop. But if anyone, we'll be issuing a request for information in the not so distant. I don't know exactly when it will be. Our procurement is up to here with all the stuff that's happening with the bipartisan infrastructure law. But as soon as we can get that out, I absolutely invite any of you to respond to that RFI. So just wanted to let you know.
So it would be great if DOE could save some of that money and use it to digitize relevant public information that already exists but is only in paper form.
That's a huge thing, yes.
And Matt or somebody earlier mentioned the class 1 wells, have to do a 10,000 year analysis. And I'm told there's lots of information in agency class 1 files that could be very useful to CCS developers, but you can't get it because it's not digital. You have to go find your way to the basement of the various agencies and look through the paper files.
Agree. But that's the kind of activity we could cover under this. It's not just getting you information. It's taking, like you said, I'm sure a vast supply of information that's sitting there on paper that we need to be digitized. So, I don't know to what extent of a lift that is, but we will get a sense of, how far we can go with that particular activity. But in the end, the idea is to start to get a handle on basin scale issues. Although it's focused on storage, it does opportunity for other programs to leverage and other interests. So we're hoping to build that in. That should be part of the application process. Will be, we're welcoming ideas of when you do these projects, what are the cross-cutting opportunities that can be explored. So and digitizing is a good one.
Okay, thank you all. We're going to change gears here. A huge issue, a growing issue, is the social license to operate for various industries that affect the subsurface. What do you see the industries doing to engage the public, improve public education, improve community involvement?
I see DOE and EPA doing a whole lot to encourage that, but I think the jury's still out on how well industry will respond. And it's not like an easy thing to do, to go out and make contact with actual members of affected communities and make sure that you do it in a way where you're listening to their concerns rather than talking down to them or figuring you just need to explain things to them and they'll be happy. And for some of these communities, there are very, very serious past problems with disproportionate burdens that have impacted them economically and socially and their health and everything else. And so it's not just a matter of community engagement in those kind of places. It's not just a matter of trying to minimize new impacts. You're also going to have to step up and figure out how you can maybe help out to some degree with the historic impacts. So it's not easy, especially given that most of the actual public has no idea what we're talking about here today, and yet you need to listen to their concerns. They may not know enough yet to know what their concerns are.
Okay, so that's some examples from the federal government. Anyone else?
I would just note that we published a study this summer on social license for energy development in Wyoming. And overall, the results were that Wyoming, it's just part of our culture, it's part of our history, it's something that we want to continue to be known as an energy state. So we saw positive support generally for energy projects in Wyoming. We then broke it down into different categories, and it was interesting to just gauge, both from a qualitative and quantitative perspective, what residents think about energy development in Wyoming by category. The most interesting aspects of the work was that we did this study in 2019. And so we were able to then look at the differences in social license by category over that period of time. And I think one of the results that we had that we were a bit concerned about is on carbon capture. We had a large category of unsure. And so that really helps us focus our education efforts, I think, within Wyoming. We saw some drops in social license, mostly for wind and solar projects. And we don't really know why that is, but we'll probably do some additional study on that. But I think it's important to try to find ways to gauge social license. I think we think we know anecdotally how our citizens feel about different projects, but it is really good to apply these scientific principles to determine how they are feeling about different things. And then again, to help target education opportunities for those different categories to gain social license.
Okay, we're getting, now that we've opened this topic, we're getting some other questions about community engagement. What would be some benefits of starting the public engagement and community engagement process earlier in a project's life cycle?
Yeah, so I think the earlier the better, and one of the needed improvements is to get started earlier. You know, a challenge there is let's take the hydrogen hubs as an example. There's already lots of people who are eager for the people who are in negotiations for the hydrogen hubs to start their community engagement. And ideally, it would be good if they started, but they haven't yet pinned down their locations well enough to be able to define specifically which communities are impacted. So if the engagement is going to be before that, it needs to be kind of a different kind of engagement than what it will need to become once the locations are settled on.
What I've observed here with our operators is they basically came to us first and talked to us as the regulator. Even though we don't have our rules in place, we were mandated by the legislature 2 years ago to oversee CO2 activity. And then they go to county government and then to the city governments and just kind of work their way down the chain until they get to the community level. And I think that's a fairly effective way of doing things. I think I've not heard an awful lot of pushback in Mobile and Baldwin County, where we have big projects announced. And I think they've done a pretty good job. They work with the legislature and the governor's office. So you have to address all levels of government and then finally get down to the people, I think. But if you've got your community leaders supporting you and county government leaders, I think that really helps out a lot. That they're in a position to answer questions when they get those questions.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, I was going to say two thoughts from what I've heard. One bounces off of Scott. Timing's important, obviously, from a private investment standpoint of announcing your project and where it's at and potentially the price of the land or what you're going after. Understanding that and those impacts. And then the other thing we didn't talk about or mention would be tribal engagement or Indigenous or First Nations engagement, which can take a little bit of a different tact in the way you approach it. I mean, I like what Nick said about that top-down type approach, but that tribal engagement is a little bit different. And it's good to understand the differences and how you approach it and the politics around that as well. And in each tribe too, how they viewed their own resources and what's good and what's bad, or their understanding of different things.
Okay, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left here. Ultimately, Scott, you had mentioned earlier that cooperation, collaboration is sometimes required by regulation, but ultimately, who's responsible for fostering collaboration in these multi-use basins? Should it be the regulators, either state, federal, or tribal, or is this something the industries should take on themselves, or are there other entities that we haven't even considered yet? Who's responsible for ultimately fostering collaboration?
Yeah, so who's responsible is probably whoever grabs the ball. And I mentioned some of the people who might do that. But one thing I did not mention was industry trade associations. So they're perfectly capable, if they want to, of organizing their industries in given regions for special projects.
Is there a trade association for carbon storage?
Yes, not as well established as the older trade associations. I guess that's obvious, isn't it? But I'm thinking really more about the oil and gas associations, who are coming at this from CCS. I don't really know how to answer this for geothermal, but for CCS, I think it would be your oil and gas associations, either state, regional, or national, or specialized. Like there are some industry CCS groups now.
It's been very interesting to see professional associations like AAPG really migrate into this space. And I think, organizing special sessions or theme sessions at some of those big national meetings. Of course, now AAPG has a specific CCS meeting. I think that's a good, since those are really industry heavy and a lot of it's sponsored by industry, I think that would be a good place to maybe find a venue to have these kinds of.
And on second thought, I think those professional societies probably are better than the trade associations, and more likely to do it, more likely to do a good job. And AAPG, SPE, and AAPG would cooperate very well on things, including the induced seismicity issue that we were talking about.
Yeah, and geothermal as well. Specifically, SPE has sponsored many workshops lately on that collaboration and crossover, technology from oil and gas to geothermal.
Anyone else on the panel want to contribute on that subject?
It's certainly in DOE's interest to help facilitate collaboration, if only, to make sure that the investments that we're making, right, are successful. I don't know if it counts as collaboration, but we continue our regional carbon sequestration partnerships through something called the regional initiatives, which are 4 of them right now. Actually, there's a whole bunch now. We just awarded a few more under FOA 2977. But the point is, those partnerships have gained and developed decades of experience and expertise, and so we consider them a technical assistance program. So for those industries and communities and stakeholders in general that are looking for help and how do we do this, those projects are there and available to help with that. So it could be for permit writing, it could be for monitoring plan development, any of those things. It's basically making that expertise available to stakeholders in projects. So like I said, that's more of a technical assistance, but I think it's really important. It's something that we're continuing. But yeah, that whatever, in any instance that DOE can help foster collaboration, again, to kind of make sure that the investments that we're making are successful is something that we continue to do generally.
So looking at Nick makes me want to mention one more organization that could have a role here, and that's the American Association of State Geologists.
Association of American State Geologists.
I'm sorry. I knew I had that wrong. I couldn't remember exactly how.
Sorry, we're a little sensitive about that.
Aaron said, triggered something. We don't only need to look at the people who are developing these projects. We need to also look at the emitters, to go out there and to be evangelical about the benefits of not emitting these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and how these projects can really mitigate that. The big utility companies and the paper mills, which are hugely important in my state, and other cement plants, all of these things.
And I'm sure they've got their own trade associations and professional organizations that could probably have a role in this space. Just a few minutes left. We had talked earlier about data, and someone mentioned, speaking of geological surveys, the Arizona Geological Survey. This is over 10 years ago, put together a national database for geothermal energy. That was actually funded by DOE as part of the National Geothermal Data System. It was funding that went straight out to the states to digitize legacy data relating to geothermal energy. Could we do the same for CCS? Could we have a nationwide program possibly that would fund state agencies to digitize their legacy data that relates to carbon storage?
Yeah, as I had mentioned earlier, that could very well be part of this carbon-based initiative we want to launch in 2024.
My pushback there would be, why are we doing it specifically for CCS? It's make it more general. All the data is, it's very much a crossover. So I get that there's a national, geothermal data repository, but why make them all separate? Let's make a national basin data repository that's available for everybody, no matter if you're interested in hydrogen, lithium, helium, geothermal, oil and gas, CCS, whatever it may be.
Very good point. Just a few seconds left here. Anyone have any final comments? If not, I'm going to wrap things up. I'd like to thank all our panelists. Big thanks to all our speakers and to our audience who provided an awful lot of great questions for us to consider. Just a reminder, if you'd like to participate, like to get notices of future meetings such as this, you can go to the National Academy's website and find the Committee on Earth Resources and sign up for our mailing list on our webpage. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you very much, everyone.